The paw-like snow slowly fell on the village, covering it like a blanket so that it merged with the equally white mountains. Thanks to the moonlight and the cold white canvas, everything could be seen without any additional lighting. People passing by the village broke the silence of the night with the loud creaking of their steps on the snow, and it echoed throughout the area. All the soldiers were walking except for the leader, who was riding a horse, and the people were so tired and frozen that no one had the strength to talk in formation. The one who rode on horseback among the other fighters and led the detachment was Lieutenant Colonel Gato of the Japanese army, and he did not differ much from other people in the same expression on his face because it was freezing cold. Driving past one of the village's alleys, Gato loudly and sharply commanded the squad to stop so that everyone could see what he saw. When the soldiers turned in the direction of the lieutenant colonel, everyone experienced a series of unpleasant sensations from fear to stupor due to a lack of understanding of what was happening. The village was strewn with the corpses of local people, and in some places there were parts of their bodies, and the snow made the scarlet blood only brighter, so you could even see where they were trying to drag someone. Looking at the dead, the lieutenant colonel ordered the soldiers to split into 3 groups and search the area to see if anyone was left alive. Gato dismounted and also gave the order for the rest of the fighters to collect all the corpses in one place to avoid a raid by wild animals. The lieutenant colonel carefully examined the people who were lying closest to him, looking for some clue as to who could have dealt with the unfortunate man like that. But the only thing that Gato has noticed so far is the same mutilation on absolutely every corpse, in the form of the absence of one eye. While the lieutenant colonel continued to examine the dead to see some more important details, one of the soldiers was already running towards him with news. When the fighter was close enough, Gato was in no hurry to turn around, but had already turned his attention to what his man was about to tell him. The poor guy was out of breath running through such snow, and when he found himself next to the commander, he bent down to catch his breath. So at first he couldn't answer the question of what had happened. And when the soldier's breathing returned to normal, he gave out important information that a survivor had been found, and this surprised the lieutenant colonel. Gato once again carefully looked over the battlefield of the unknown creature with the locals, and after a moment commanded the soldier to lead him to the one who could survive. Once inside the hut, the lieutenant colonel asked the hunter what had happened in this village, and why absolutely all the people in this place were dead. The poor guy, although he survived, looked no better, because he was also on the verge of death. So being in a state of shaking, he stuttered and answered only that it was Leah. Gato asked a counter-question about the latest information about who this Leah was, to which the hunter said that the girl was the daughter of elders who disappeared in the mountains and returned a month later. It was very difficult for the hunter to control himself because, unlike these soldiers, he knew what had happened to the girl and what fate awaited them all if they met. Therefore, considering that they would most likely die anyway, he began to gradually explain in a trembling voice that it was all about the curse. The hunter explained that there was a certain curse on Mount Murion, where Leah went, and at first glance it was no different from other mountains. But there was a legend about Mount Murion that said that a person could bring trouble upon himself if he drank water from its springs, which contained dangerous energy. Water has always been the best conductor not only for living beings but also for the energy that accumulated in the spring with every drop. Leah went hunting to bring her people in the village the opportunity to feed themselves among the cold rocks. But hunting is a difficult business, even if you haven't fought a wild animal, and as in this case you lost your way, which is why Leah was tormented by thirst, and she ran to the first source of water but couldn't hold on and fell into the gorge. The girl fell into the crystal clear but icy water of that same cursed Murian spring and sank to the very bottom. Miraculously surviving, Leah, coughing, crawled out onto the shore, not yet knowing what awaited her ahead and whether she had really survived. Considering that the girl fell into the water completely and did not expect this at all, she swallowed a lot of the damned water. The hunter summed up that the lieutenant colonel knew that the corpses they saw on the street were the work of that same damned daughter of the leader who had treated everyone cruelly. The man's eyes filled with tears, although he also knew how to kill, but they were animals, and he did not do it as cruelly as Leah. Before the hunter's eyes, there was still that terrible picture of the girl's massacre of people, after which it was difficult to call her a person, because she was more like a merciless monster thirsty for blood. Gato sat in front of the hunter and was silent for a while, digesting the information and watching the grown man tremble and cry. The lieutenant colonel did not take the local resident's story seriously, so he ironically asked where this Leah was now, to which the man replied that she had gone east. Rising from his chair, The commander gave the order to his soldiers to send a chase after the scoundrel, to which the hunter did not pay any attention at all and continued to sit with his head down and face covered. But Gato wasn't going to leave the man alone, so before leaving, he turned to the hunter so that he would finally raise his head. When the man heard that he would have to show the way to those who would follow in Leah's footsteps, he felt even worse, and his body broke out in a cold sweat. Images of the terrible tearing apart of people by a young girl and the understanding that he was now being asked to go to certain death floated before his eyes again. The nervous hunter jumped up and immediately refused to show the way, repeating to the lieutenant colonel that Leah was no longer a person, but a creature who only enjoyed feasting on fresh flesh. But the man's nerves were sharply restrained by the pistol that Gato put right to his forehead, and it would be quite logical to actually shoot himself now than to go where you will be eaten alive. The lieutenant colonel looked closely at the unfortunate man and clarified that for him, the hunter was not a human being either, so he gave him a choice right now. The choice was not great, since Gato warned the man that he would either become a guide with a chance of survival or immediately become a piece of meat. The hunter's eyes filled with tears because he knew that in both cases he would be dead, and this tormented his soul even more. Therefore, when the bodies of local residents were burned, the man still headed to the car to set off. The hunter sat in the front of the car as a navigator so that, as had been agreed, he could show the way that would lead everyone to the monster that they didn't really believe in. The man turned to the soldier sitting behind him, asking if he understood where they were going, but he ignored the local. The hunter saw that these stupid soldiers didn't respect him at all, so he simply warned them one last time that everyone who went after the monster was doomed to die. The fighter sitting behind really didn't take the man seriously, looking at him like he was a pathetic brat who was raving about some incomprehensible girl who was just as sick in the head as he was. For some reason, the driver still hadn't moved, so the soldier, who didn't want to be inside with the sick country bumpkin anyway, shouted at him to finally go. A truck with soldiers and weapons moved with a roar behind the passenger car through the loose snow, in order to be ready for anything. Gato remained behind the transport watching the crew, still thinking about everything that the local resident had told him. Being stern and looking at the world soberly, the lieutenant colonel still found what happened to be nothing more than an attack by a turret, but not a man, but a beast, because it was difficult for the brain to believe that not only was this done by a man, but also by a weak girl. Upon arrival at the site, the soldiers went to scout out the area and set up camp. One of the servicemen approached the chief with a question whether to give the order to the rest of the people to return to the detachment, but the commander answered negatively and said that they would go up the mountain. The commander-in-chief of this operation explained that they needed to study the very gorge where the girl had fallen, so he gave the order to be on full combat alert. The commander turned around to carefully examine the damn mountain from a distant angle first and understand where it would be best for them to move. There was a high probability that this view of the majestic rock was the last thing a man in uniform would see. If we omit the details of everything the hunter told us, the commander now simply beheld a majestic mountain formation under a huge layer of perennial snow. But here in some places there were springs babbling, which were the same snow flowing down from the mountains, and in the commander's head, the insidious word monster never went away. The flow of water in these mountains was a continuous process that could be watched forever, and it was especially fascinating to listen to it. Nature has ensured that even if the mountains are covered with snow, there will always be an opportunity to quench your thirst. But in addition to natural forces, there was something hidden in the water that could destroy in case of carelessness, although at first glance everything looks harmless. Water can truly be powerful, and from this it follows that even a small part of it will make its own adjustments for the whole world. Those who stood on the surface of the earth did not suspect that beneath them a whole unknown life was raging, which could be stronger than their weapons. Among those deaths that were spreading with terrible force in the middle of the water, there was an island that, compared to other places, resembled the only safe place. The water carried the conversation of two people about whether what they were looking for could be on this island, and if one person answered that most likely this was the same island, then the other one had a hard time believing it because this was the third one. The girl pointed her finger at the boat, asking her father if the boatman had fallen asleep, but the man cut her off abruptly by asking his daughter Chiuk to row and not chat, which irritated the latter. Chiuk got out of the boat as quickly as possible upon arrival on shore and stretched thoroughly, complaining that her lower back almost left the deck without its owner. It was so numb. The daughter, again with a hint of indignation, asked her father to leave the boat alone, since she would definitely not leave on her own 2 feet, but the man explained that they should be prepared for anything, considering that they were on the island for the first time. And while the father walked quietly and calmly into the depths of the island, the daughter behind him was just dying of boredom every now and then, considering this patch of land in the middle of the water a terribly boring place. Cha complained to her father that it was too quiet and boring here, not noticing many warning signs. Suddenly, the man stopped and asked his daughter to stop talking for a second and turn her attention to something important. In the middle of the clearing on the island, there was a hut, but there were no signs next to it that anyone lived in it. Choke carefully opened the doors of the small house and, after greeting her, asked if she could ask a question, but the word question never came out of her mouth. Before the father and daughter was a terrible picture of how someone had brutally dealt with two people and the entire hut was covered in their blood. Looking at the state of the bodies of the unfortunates, the girl did not even know what to say and simply froze in a stupor. The father entered the hut first and gestured to his daughter not to enter yet but to stand at the threshold, so Chiak kept her weapon at the ready. The daughter looked around quietly, asking her father what kind of beast could have torn such strong men to pieces. But her father denied that it was a beast, because it would not only have bitten out their throats, and there were no traces of paws or clumps of fur around. The man turned his attention to the neck of one of the corpses, where a mark more consistent with a human hand was visible. Chiok was skeptical about her father's words, and just as she wanted to say something about it, a growl was heard from the street. The guys carefully sat down so that they couldn't be seen from the window, but so that it would be possible to see who was growling there. While something like a man was walking past the hut, Chiok whispered to ask if it was the killer, but the father immediately hissed at his daughter. A little further from the hut, someone's voice was heard calling for help, which was not the best idea. The man saw at that moment that there was more than one creature here, but they were not going to attack each other, but simply reacted to the appearance with some strange sounds. The father also noted for himself how fast these creatures are, because the one that appeared next to the first one ran incredibly quickly toward the person calling for help. Chiak, still in a whisper but already more nervously, asked her father what kind of psychos these were, and why they looked like people, but not people at the same time. The second creature got to the victim and devoured it indiscriminately, and when the father saw this, he immediately told his daughter that he didn't give a damn about the assignment and that they needed to get out of here right now. Having miraculously reached the place where the journey began, the father asked his daughter to stand guard while he unwound the rope in order to quickly leave this place. Chiak did her job properly, but then she heard a scream from the side of the hut somewhere. Someone was shouting for Uncle Yun to finally wake up and become like before. Chiak noticed that in the distance the silhouette of that same sick man was visible, but she could not make out who was screaming there. And when Chiak looked closely, she saw that the girl was screaming and approaching the psycho, but she didn't understand why she was doing it. Since that same uncle no longer responded to the cries of his relative, she decided to act more decisively, and it looked like she was swinging. The girl hit her uncle on the head with a rock, who clearly could not be returned to normal life, which greatly surprised Chiak, who immediately called the girl a fool. Blood flowed from the creature's head from such a blow, and if this had already killed an ordinary person, then not such an evil spirit was ready to devour living flesh. The creature, which did not understand human speech, simply turned in that direction, as if at an invitation to eat fresh meat. The unfortunate woman, with tears in her eyes, begged her uncle to stop behaving like this and not to come near her. But it was too late. There was no more reason in the creature's head, and it rushed towards its new victim, picking up speed and not realizing that it was its relative. The creature opened its mouth ready to bite off fresh flesh as soon as it got close enough to her. It is unknown how, but the girl was able to resist such a huge monster without giving up hope that he would eventually come to his senses. The girl, holding her uncle, asked him for the sake of all that is holy to finally wake up, but this was impossible. Chiok, looking at what was happening ahead, already understood that things were bad while her father ran to the boat to untie it. It was very difficult for the girl to decide to help a young person like her, so for some time she turned away so as not to give in to this. But in addition to her eyes, her ears also heard, and the sound was terrible. Cursing and spitting on all doubts, Chiak fired into the air, realizing that she was doing such a stupid thing, but she could not leave the girl to die like this. The huge shot echoed instantly across the entire shore where there were still living people. Chiak loudly shouted to the bastard to take her hands off the girl or her brains would end up outside her skull, which was why her father was in shock, because now the situation had become more complicated. Of course, this hungry and evil creature rushed to the new victim who was noisy enough to notice her, and after the former uncle, His niece rushed. The girl made an attempt to stop her unfortunate relative, but the creature had enough strength for three, so everything was in vain, and Chiok immediately caught this moment for herself. This sick bastard not only ran around like crazy and was so strong, but he also made a sound that didn't even resemble a sick person, and the threat of surrendering or being shot didn't help him. Chiok realized that there was no point in giving any warnings, so she shot the creature in the knee, glad that now it would slow down. But no matter, the creature continued to run even with a bullet in its leg, which is why the young lady was in shock, because the leg as a whole was almost torn apart. The distance between the living and non-living creatures was decreasing very quickly, and the bullets did not take the hungry big guy. Uncle Yoon, or what was left of him, had almost jumped over the destroyed boat and the meal was just a stone's throw away. Chiok's knees were buckling because death was close and the bullets weren't helping at all, which made the blood inside her turn cold. The girl made another shot in the stomach to somehow stop the monster, but this did not help either, and there was very little time left before the collision. Chiok looked into the eyes for the first time without understanding whose they were, and who was standing in front of her now because the eyes were actually human. But the look was not like a human's, and when the creature was at gunpoint, his eyes filled with tears. Here the young lady was completely dumbfounded, unable to find any explanation for such a phenomenon, but she knew one thing for sure, and it was now or never. Chiok shot the monster right in the head and felt his last touch on herself, which she will never forget in her life, because after the touch, his hand slid across the girl's face and then across her body, leaving blood everywhere. In addition to the fact that Chiok felt the blood on herself, not only of the one she killed, but also of his victims, this carcass also fell on her like dead weight. The father wiped his daughter's face with his hand, asking her to take a deep breath in and out, and also to take her time and calm down, and that he was nearby. Chiok, still in her dad's arms, looked over to where the girl she had saved should have been. The girl noticed that the niece of the deceased uncle was indeed still in the place from which she had run after him. But the most alarming thing was that the girl was not walking towards the travelers, but away from them, towards the hut. The niece looked no better, and she walked forward, exhausted, barely moving her legs. What happened to the niece of the deceased Uncle Yoon was stronger than her human strength, so she was able to walk a little. In front of the family that had sailed to the island simply to complete the task, the girl fell dead on the sand. The man rushed to the victim in horror, asking if she was okay, because so far she was the only person from this island who had managed to survive, which meant that this was their chance to understand what had happened here. The girl did not respond to the man's cries and did not even move, which indicated a very dire situation. Chiok couldn't bear such stress in such a short period of time and wiped away the tears she could no longer hold back. The girl took the victim on her back and asked her father to wait until she woke up, so now she would carry her to a safe place, to which her father said that he would inspect the area for now. But the island was just an island standing in the middle of a huge amount of water with its rocks and vegetation. In the hut, which was surrounded by a stone fence, travelers were betrayed with an injured local resident. Chiok looked after the girl, wiping her with water to at least wash away the blood, and asked her father if he had found the same sick person who had run after the victim from the hut the last time, and he replied that he had found one, but the creature was already dead. To my surprise, the girl woke up and immediately began to mumble something inaudibly under her breath, which was very difficult to understand. The father warned his daughter that if the islander did not wake up before sunset, she would need to be dragged into the boat, but Chiok asked to be given the opportunity to check something. It was not in vain that the daughter asked her father to wait, because the girl really did open her eyes and both of them had already noticed it. The check only confirmed for herself that there was no need to rush to take the victim with her, because now the worst had happened. The resident, who had just been lying unconscious, immediately jumped to her feet and towards the girl, so she immediately grabbed the pistol. Chiok moved to a safe distance and, pointing the barrel at the suspicious person, asked her not to rush because she saw what happened to her uncle. The father was shocked by his daughter's actions and asked her to immediately stop doing such things, but she, not paying attention to the remark, asked the resident how she had escaped from the sick. Chiok, very nervous but at the same time sternly, asked again how the girl managed to escape without a single scratch, and why everyone here looked strange as one. Dad reminded his daughter not to show hostility first, but Chiok mentioned that this resident was here with the others, which means she could also attack at any moment. Having gathered courage, the remnants of which were still inside, Chiok asked the mysteriously surviving local once again who they were. But the courage evaporated as quickly as the understanding of the situation after the girl saw the most incomprehensible actions of the stranger in front of her. The survivor came close to the barrel and, putting it to her forehead, calmly told the girl to kill her right now if she really intended to do it. Again, the veins trembled like over-tightened strings, and Chalk shouted that she was not joking at the moment and was really ready to shoot, so it was better to answer the question. The resident was silent and simply held the gun, not reacting to the girl's cries about what the hell happened on this island. And finally, with tears in her eyes, the niece of the deceased uncle answered that none of the locals survived, and everyone died in a very short time. But the strangest thing was that the girl whose eye color changed and whose tears became more numerous was only able to say that so many deaths occurred because of them. The man understood that the matter could really end badly, so he did not hesitate, and approaching the girls, took the pistol from his daughter, saying only that it was enough. Father Chiak asked the island resident about those mysterious individuals about whom nothing more had been said yet, but she was in no hurry to answer anything, and only looked at the stranger with a dim gaze from under her forehead. The girl started to tell something, but her eyes filled with tears again, and it seemed that this source was bottomless because the crying did not stop. So the man said that if it was hard to tell, then in that case there was no need to do it. But after everything she had experienced, the island resident decided to tell her story, and she began by saying that her name was Kumlan. Kumlan decided to spell everything out from the very beginning, and therefore even specified that she lost her hearing at the age of 5 when she suffered from cerebral palsy. The girl clearly remembered that ill-fated morning sometime later, when she grew up and out of old habit, sat in her favorite place enjoying the beauty of nature and the wind that carried different smells. The place under the shade of the tree where Kumlan sat could smell the sea breeze and the smell of the food her fellow villagers were preparing and the blooming vegetation on the island. At some point, what she saw at the bottom of the break became something new for Kimlin, because before there was a different view there. The girl's fellow villagers crowded around a tent that had never been on the island before, and next to it stood a man in uniform. The people of the island stood waiting to see why they had been called to this tent and continued to look at the entrance in silence. A man in military uniform actually approached the entrance to the tent, and the locals immediately began to whisper about the fact that the Hoseon troops needed ordinary people from them, but no one knew the answer. The commander called the elder to him and gave the order to call here everyone who was listed, and this was 6 or 7 people who then entered the barracks one by one. And then Kumlan remembered how she saw that Uncle Yun and Uncle Dong were also there, as was her father, who returned home after some time. The girl was eager to find out who those people were downstairs in the strange house and what they wanted from the locals. Father Kumlan sighed heavily and explained to his daughter that people offered him a job on the mainland at the medical center, but he had to refuse because he believed that if you were a native of the island, then there was nothing for you to do on the mainland. The father also mentioned that they were given some kind of medicine, supposedly for the pandemic, but Kimlin already had words in her head about working at the medical center that she liked. The girl was filled with hope and the opportunity to get to the mainland, but completely missed what her father said about the pandemic and medicine. Before entering the barracks, the duty officer's cries were heard that entry was prohibited, and another soldier standing next to the tent responded to this. When asked what was going on here, the soldier indignantly and pointed his finger at Kimlin, who was standing behind him, and began to get indignant. But the girl interrupted him and politely asked that all she wanted was to get a job, since even disabled people could work here. The soldier who listened to all this was surprised by how eager this resident was to get to the mainland, because he knew more than she did. The employees began to whisper in Japanese that the check had not yet been completed and that they were only checking men. One of the soldiers put on a more polite smile and told the girl that not only could she, but she even had to come to their barracks. The soldier said his superior's phrase about how everything has its own benefit, and he knew perfectly well what he was talking about. But the resident took it personally and was inspired by the answer. The girl was warned that the conditions for being hired were only to have her photo taken and take a very important medicine, but as Kimlin recalled, even then, the water and the pills gave off a terrible stench that she still remembers. Kumlan continued her story by saying that as always she climbed to her favorite place on the mountain, but on that very stone her body was seized by the most terrible pain in her life. The girl clearly remembered how, due to the sensation as if something was moving in her throat, she lost consciousness, unable to withstand it. Not knowing yet whether it was fortunate or unfortunate, but when the girl woke up, she realized that her hearing had returned to her, but this did not make her condition any better. Tears were flowing from her eyes just like now, and Kumlan never left the thought of what it was like to hear the world. But at that moment, Terrible sounds reached her ears that were in no way connected with her ideas. The poor thing lay on the ground, covering her ears tightly with her hands, and felt her head hurt very badly from what she had heard. All around you could hear the screams of local residents instead of the wind or the singing of birds or the sound of the surf, and it created the impression that your ears were about to burst from it. As if through a fog, the girl heard someone shout her name, and without taking her hands away from her ears, she looked in that direction. The father ran up to his daughter in horror, shouting at her to get off the island as quickly as possible, and this looked frightening for a man who was first unconscious and then suddenly regained his hearing. Even when the father grabbed his daughter by the hand, she still couldn't say anything other than, "Daddy," and because she didn't understand what was happening, she couldn't just jump up and run. Trying to see through her tears what was happening around her, Kumlan finally asked what was going on and why they had to run away. But there was no need to answer, because the girl herself saw a terrible picture of how people, having become worse than any fierce and hungry predator, ate their own kind. Kumlan recognized her Uncle Don in the monster, and for a split second she froze, unable to move. The fact that the girl hesitated played a cruel joke on her because the monster grabbed her leg, not wanting to miss the opportunity to feast on fresh flesh. The evil spirit sank its teeth into the girl's leg and she screamed furiously in pain, so the father had no choice but to lift the stone over the monster's head. The man threw a stone block at his loved one, loudly asking him for forgiveness and turning away. Now, without wasting time, the father once again grabbed his daughter by the hand and asked her to concentrate on the fact that they needed to be saved. Kumlan ran across the clearing, feeling like her heart was about to jump out of her chest from everything that was happening, and she still needed to have time to hide or even swim away from the island. For the first time in her life, the girl was not happy that her uncle was still alive even after a boulder fell on him, but her father shouted to continue running towards the cliff. The young resident understood that no one would be prepared for what happened to them, but what she and her father saw on the side of the crossing, while standing on the cliff, completely knocked the ground out from under their feet. The last inhabitants of the island watched as the soldiers made sure that no one could leave the island by destroying all the boats. The stick, which still had two ends, was now locked into a wheel from which it seemed there was no other way out except to jump off the cliff. There were no other options. The father and daughter could not even find the words to describe how desperate they both were now about what had happened. At some point, Kumlan exclaimed in surprise but could not say anything, so she frightened her father even more. The girl lifted her long skirt to look at the condition of the wound, but her suspicions were confirmed. That terrible bite on the leg was gone, and the father reminded his daughter whether she remembered what he had told her about the medicine that she needed to take. The man warned his daughter that everyone who had now turned into a monster had taken these pills, so he earnestly asked her not to come close to them, because those creatures were capable of biting through the throat. How scared Kumlan became because she also took that medicine, which meant she was threatened with the same fate. But her father did not listen to her, but only felt how he himself was also turning into a monster, so he restrained himself with all his might. Since Dad spoke very quietly, his daughter decided to come closer and asked him to repeat what he had just said. But instead of turning around and repeating his words, the father simply threw himself down from the cliff, and Kimlin ran screaming to the edge, unable to believe what the person closest to her had done, and the last thing he shouted at her was a request to hide. Kumlan ended her story by talking about her father as a hero who threw himself off a cliff to protect her, but he never knew that she had taken the medicine. Cheok immediately asked why in that case the girl never turned into a monster, because there is no logic in that case. The father turned to his daughter, letting her know that she shouldn't put so much pressure on the person, but the girl continued to say that, in addition to the fact that the woman was still alive, she also spoke well for someone who was deaf. Kumlan curled up into a ball, explaining that she had been practicing pronunciation since childhood, and then the girl's voice began to tremble. Once again, the resident burst into tears and answered Chiak's question about why she was still not a monster by saying that she herself would like to know why everyone was dead except her, and this indicated that the girl was in pain not only from a physical point of view. Kumlan listed that those who took this medicine showed symptoms such as rapid healing of wounds and strength equal to two people, if not more. And finally the girl, breaking into a scream, shared her worst fear that at any moment she too could turn into a bloodthirsty monster like the others on the island. Chuck felt embarrassed that she had brought the girl to such a state, so she replied that she understood her and left her alone without asking any more questions. The girl called her father, and he, meeting her gaze, nodded in agreement with what had already been agreed upon between them. Chiok approached the resident and asked her to listen very carefully to everything that was told to her. And then the girl sat down closer to the victim and explained that first, she and her father would help bury the inhabitants of this island so that their souls could rest in peace, and then they could all go to Manchuria together. Kumlan repeated the new word to herself and immediately asked Chiok to tell her more about this place. Chiok only added that it was still dangerous to stay on the island and that there was help in Manchuria, but the girl said nothing. The girl happily told Kimlan that in the place where they would sail, there was a chance to find out what the Japanese fed the resident, but she immediately and flatly refused. Chiok was shocked that the one who needed help, and even more she needed it, refused the opportunity to be saved. Having made another attempt, Chiok argued that she should leave the island, saying that she could be cured and perhaps even take revenge. But Kimlan reminded her that there was a risk of her transformation, and that was on the way. The resident immediately asked if they should cut off her limbs if her condition worsened, and then Chiok couldn't find what to answer because Kumlan's arguments were more reasonable. The survivor thanked the aliens for what they had already done for her, risking their lives, and therefore asked to leave her here. Kumlan looked out the window and explained her choice by saying that if she had the opportunity to hear now, and these were her last days of life, she would like to spend them on her home island, and she amazed Chiok with this courage. The warrior silently stood up, pulling her cap over her head, and she no longer even had any thoughts of somehow forcing the girl to do something differently. But at the same time, they would still fulfill the promise regarding the burial of the bodies. They wrote the names of the dead on whatever they could find, and whoever had what, but it still related to the honor of helping the deceased to pass away peacefully to another world so that his soul would not wander between worlds. While the father was finishing his prayer, and Kimlan was leveling the ground in places, Chiok informed her that it was time for them to go, and she thanked him again. Chiok took out the case that contained the knife and handed it to Kimlan, saying that she almost forgot to leave it to her. The girl asked the resident to take this knife and keep it with her in case of danger, or just the need to feed herself. Kumlan did not understand such a gesture, so when leaving, Chiok said something else important regarding the knife, namely, if she suddenly changes her mind and goes to Manchuria, then she should ask any Hosean resident about the bloodhound Yunchak, and they will help. Finally, the dangerous journey was over, and the family in the boat headed back to their home, sailing again past the boat in which, as it turned out, no one had slept for a long time. Chiok now looked at the empty ship in a completely different way, but at first she remained silent and did not say anything to her father and continued to row. But a bloodhound is a bloodhound for a reason, to be curious. So the daughter couldn't help but ask her father if what happened was connected with that Manchurian guy. But he replied that it was just empty chatter. The father clarified for his daughter that upon completion of the assignment, they would try to make inquiries together, and Chiok, just in case, repeated the name of the resident to herself to fix it in her head. As they sailed away from Chiok Island, the feeling that he and Kimlan would definitely meet again never left them. For the first time in her life, the girl experienced completely new sensations from being on the island, especially when it got dark. And along with the darkness came various thoughts, one of which was connected with death, which could happen to Kimlan instantly, because in the place where her dead father lay there were poisonous flowers. The girl picked a flower and was ready to follow her father, but she saw money lying in front of her, as if he had left it there on purpose. With these thoughts, Kumlan wanted to go into the water as deep as possible, not yet fully understanding why. The girl again looked closely at the note, with money in which the father asked his daughter only to continue to live, but she no longer understood why and for what purpose. And in her other hand, she held the opportunity to leave the world without turning into a monster. As it turned out, Kimlan's hearing not only returned but became even more acute. And in addition to her thoughts about whether her existence could be called life, she also heard someone approaching. The resident was not mistaken, and people were sailing in a boat very far from her, and she was even able to hear them talking about how they needed to start work as soon as they set foot on the shore. In the note and the money, Kumlan saw a meaningless existence, and in her hand with a flower, a departure from the world before reason left her body first. Having put everything together, the girl asked herself what she should do, and so far the scales could not tip either towards death or towards life. Surprisingly, what actually responded was a rumbling in the stomach, and this was able to distract Kumlan from her thoughts. The girl stood in the middle of the water and loudly and deeply inhaled and exhaled before performing an important action for herself. Kumlan sank completely under the water, clutching the stone bottom with her hands, thinking about why she was racking her brains like that, because she was nothing more than an island girl who was only looking for a better life on the mainland. Having risen to the surface again, the resident felt that the boat was already very close, and she felt this for the first time. Standing in the middle of a huge amount of water, Kumlan felt that her eyes, ears, and nose began to incredibly vividly sense everything that surrounded her. After diving into the water, the girl realized that she began to feel differently than usual, because before she could not see the smell. And now Kumlan clearly saw the trail of that medicine that stretched across the entire water like a winding snake. And this spoke of the discovery of new abilities. The resident stood firmly on her feet, feeling not only the water and the rocky bottom, but also that very same trail. Now Kumlan cast aside all doubts, and she no longer looked at the amount of time remaining or the length of the path. The girl looked at the approaching boat and understood that now everything would depend only on her, which meant she would do everything in her power. Manhwa Island was as quiet as ever, and if it weren't for the moonlight, it would have been as dark as a tomb, although in fact, that's how it was. A boat arrived on the shore, which Kumlan had sensed a long time ago, and the soldiers were unloading in the meantime. The squad leader reminded that their main task was concentration and observation, and when meeting with test subjects, avoiding contact and immediately reporting on the situation. The commander-in-chief wanted to add something else, but he saw something in the distance that confused him and ordered one of the soldiers to go and find out what was going on there. As he climbed higher up the bank, the soldier could not believe his eyes because there were many gravestones in the sand. It didn't take much intelligence to understand that all these plaques and stones were there for a reason, but that people were buried in the sand. And since the soldier really didn't have much sense in his head, he shouted at the top of his lungs that where he was standing, there were graves that had appeared not so long ago, and the commander couldn't find anything else to say except call him an idiot. Unlike the crazy soldier whose instinct for self-preservation is zero, the commander was quietly indignant about the fact that he asked to behave as inconspicuously as possible, but his gaze immediately changed when it dawned on him what graves were being discussed. As soon as the main man thought that it was impossible for anyone to survive here, the man who proved him otherwise appeared behind him. Kumlan appeared with a knife to her throat behind the commander's back like a ghost, whose existence shocked all the soldiers on the shore. The fighters were so self-confident with weapons in their hands and commanded to let the main one go, but this girl was no longer afraid of anything. The commander didn't pay any attention to the fact that he was captured, because for him she was some small fry, but his attitude changed after he turned to her. That evening, the commander-in-chief was not destined to experience all the stages of acceptance, and for now he was stuck at the stage of anger when he saw that the girl was hung with grenades and was holding one of them in her hands. While the battalion commander was making very loud and harsh threats to some wild island resident, she softly and calmly replied that she did not understand what he was telling her, and then putting a grenade in her mouth showed that she did not need empty chatter. And when the commander's head was blown off, Kumlan looked at the others and said that she would really like to enjoy the screams that night. The shore of the island turned into a bright place in the middle of the dark night, and the water seemed to be trying to equalize its light with the stars. In addition to the fire, which was growing larger, smoke also appeared, but in the morning, the girl would not remember how and in what way she managed to fight off the soldiers. The only thing that Kumlan understood was that she had survived, and yet one memory remained, and it looked like the mouth of the last soldier, whose throat she had bitten open and froze, after which she got into a boat and sailed to the mainland. The girl rowed with all her might, feeling how desperately she wanted to sleep and how much longer she could swim in this state. Kumlan was able to swim to the mainland and even walked deeper into it for some time to find at least some shelter and only then allow herself to close her eyes. Walking through the dense forest, the girl clearly followed the direction of the smell that she had sensed on the island. The trail stretched further behind the mountain, but it was no longer possible for tired legs to overcome such a path again. Kumlan looked forward, but her legs really weren't listening anymore, and this time she wasn't going to resist the heavy fatigue that was covering her more and more. Having found herself in a small stone gorge, the girl fell and never got up, admitting that she really had no more strength. The islander looked at the hands in which she held the last thing connected to her life and breathed heavily. Kumlan prudently placed 2 poisonous flowers on the very top of the bag, so that if anything happened she would be prepared to die without causing harm to anyone. And since everything that the girl had collected before sailing was in the bag and so that nothing would get lost, she tightened it properly. The only thing that Kimlin sincerely wanted was to sleep, and her eyelids really did get heavier with each blink. But one thought still worried her, namely, whether she would also become a monster when she woke up. Closing her eyes, the girl decided that she would think about the question of turning into a bloodthirsty killer after she got some sleep. About 2 days later, in a dense forest with a bald spot in the middle of it in the form of a clearing, a man was walking loudly and irritably, cursing, and along the way, as the man was cursing and cursing everyone and everything, he was also taking off his false mustache. The hat was also removed from the head and the hair was fixed with a loud cry about how this unknown person was fed up with the idiotic search. The glasses that created a certain image were also already unnecessary, so the man took them off and continued to complain into the air about how he literally didn't have enough of a couple of days to get his ass out of these lands. The guy grabbed his head and shouted to the whole forest why he was being punished like this and how he managed to get into this shit. After such therapy, the young man exhaled and called Hansik, who was already rustling leaves in the bushes nearby. The next stage of therapy appeared before the very upset man in the form of a black cat, who also loudly greeted the guest. The cat climbed onto the young man like lightning, and although his claws were clinging quite strongly to the fabric and skin, he was still glad to meet the furry one, and then warned him that they would most likely be moving. The guy started making a face like that idiot major and explaining to the cat that all of this happened precisely because of him, and then grimacing, parodied his speech about how there was nothing difficult to do just to show the way. The tail didn't care about all this human nonsense, and he simply began to happily lick his owner, who, gritting his teeth, continued to tell him that the major was exchanging favors for favors, and that at the moment this was an opportunity to get away to Japan. The young man took a bottle out of the hollow and indignantly addressed the void, asking whether they really thought he was an idiot. After all, what kind of smart person would ask a murderer to be his guide? And just half a day ago, this pseudo-mustached young man was sitting opposite a man in a cafe and watching him hold a clearly heavy head in his hand. The guy turned to Hyun Nim and informed him that information about the possibility of leaving would only arrive in 2 days. The man immediately asked the question point blank with caution whether the young man didn't trust him, and without waiting for an answer, he said to give him the rest of the money upon arrival, to which he decided to ask why his partner looked so tired. Looking down at the floor, the man was surprised that the guy still hadn't heard about the searches of the districts on the orders of Major Yanagi in search of a certain psychopath. The young man asked again if he had misheard, but the old man replied that it was not for nothing that she was called that, because the absurdity of the situation was that the girl had single-handedly killed several soldiers, so it was necessary to catch her alive, and at that moment the major arrived. The guy couldn't believe what the old man said, so he called it complete nonsense, and he agreed, suspecting that this was just an excuse for the major to assign another task to someone. While the man laughed out loud and continued to talk about how it was impossible to find some strange young lady, the guy already pressed his head into his shoulders, noticing the visitor decisively heading towards them. The major walked up to the table and, hitting it with his hand, cried out that he had finally found them, causing the man to jump up from the table, no less nervous than the young man. The old man even began to stutter, but still managed to somehow articulate how the major himself had come to visit them, and he immediately replied that he had come to exchange a few words specifically about that crazy woman. But the most interesting thing was that the major turned his attention from the old man to the young guy, and taking him by the shoulder, clarified that he had come specifically to see the young man Pyongyul. Pengo let out a nervous laugh, pretending to be in shock, and then began to justify himself by saying that he was a simpleton. But he didn't have time to finish, and instead the major continued, saying that he was a crook who had deceived the head of the financial department of the chosen bank, Shiksan. The old man got angry at the young man, muttering through his teeth what kind of misdeeds he had already managed to do, after which the nervous laughter turned into quiet hysteria and scratching the back of his head as well as apologies. Just as Pyongyul was about to run away, 2 big guys appeared behind him, indicating that the situation was shitty, but the major cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence and clarified that this was not why he had come. The situation became doubly shitty when the man of the law approached the thief with one request. The major, realizing that the young man had nowhere to go, decided to mention that incident in Manchuria and asked again about how he had managed to survive. And now, standing in the forest, Pyongyul thought warily about how much the major knew about him, because his life could depend on it in the future. The cat clearly had to go about his animal business and was tired of listening to this leather one, so he jumped on the shoulders just as quickly as he had jumped on them. Pyongyul was surprised at how quickly his pet decided to run away, so he called him heartless. But then he heard how someone nearby barely showed signs of life, so the cat jumped down just in time. The young man immediately realized that such sounds were definitely not from the animal world, so he looked up and assessed how he could climb the mountain. For his own safety, the guy first put out a call asking if anyone was there, but there was no response, so he simply continued his chain of thoughts about the fact that the major's request was deceptive. The climb up was not so easy for Pyongyul, but now curiosity was getting the better of him. So going down would be stupid. And in his head, meanwhile, the monologue about how one could entrust the matter to a swindler continued. As soon as the young man thought that he didn't care about the major's plans and that it would be better for him to just run away from here before they caught up with him, he saw a girl lying on the ground. Pyongyul jumped down, not believing his own eyes, so he was in no hurry to call anyone, because who knows what kind of person he is. But when he came closer and saw clothes that were not like those of the locals, the guy grabbed his head, realizing that it was he who had found the missing item, and so easily, and the first time. All that was left was to figure out whether it was the girl's blood on her and, in that case, whether she was even alive, since she looked lousy. The young man was still in no hurry to draw conclusions and call someone, because a person could have looked like that even after a shipwreck. It was strange for Pyongyul to ask forgiveness from an unconscious girl, but he did it, and clarified that he was not stealing anything, but simply wanted to understand what kind of person was in front of him and whether he should be afraid. What was in the woman's handbag surprised the guy a lot because one dagger wasn't enough. There was a hand bomb lying further on. Also, in the already withered flowers, Pyongyul recognized a deadly poisonous herb that just anyone would not carry around in a bag like that. The young man paid tribute to such a complete set, but he was still confused by those flowers, and looking at the girl, he wondered if she really wanted to kill herself. The guy was distracted from his silent thoughts by the cries of his assistant, who was calling the major, asking if everything was okay with him. The poor major was catching his breath heavily, while his assistant led him by the arm and persuaded him to rest while they looked for the swindler themselves. But he flatly refused because he had also been ordered to look. And the swindler, meanwhile, also pretended to be a corpse. Pyongyul was sure that the girl was dead until he lay down next to her and heard a light snore, which made him understand that she was sleeping soundly. The thoughts in the young man's head could not calm down, because on the one hand, he could not believe that such a weak girl could kill the soldiers alone, and on the other hand, he knew firsthand how appearances can be deceiving. Shaking his head, Pyongyul tried to bring himself to his senses, reminding himself that this had nothing to do with him. In her sleep, Kuman muttered a request to her father not to die and not to leave her alone, and then the swindler's heart couldn't take it anymore, although it was usually his job to fool people. The guy looked at the poor girl and mentally begged her not to cry. And with such a pitiful face, and then he got completely angry and also cut off in his head that he would not help, so he told the girl to get out of it herself. And at this time, people appeared again on the island of Manhwa, but not the same inhabitants who were there before. On the island, other people were hard at work, putting the bodies of sick people into a huge fire, taking them out of graves or huts. The commander, as always, sat in the barracks and kept records of how the reconnaissance group that arrived at night was all killed, and on the island itself, they were unable to achieve the desired mutation. One of the workers approached the chief with the news that he had found the body of some young girl and she was indeed lying on the ground. Standing in the shadow of the tent, the commander coldly and briefly replied that he understood this news, which put the worker in an awkward position of misunderstanding. The major leaned on his crutches and walked out of the barracks, and a worker approached him, asking if they would transfer his salary to him, as always, through his son. But the soldier, for his part, also decided to mention to the man that he had recently been in the hospital. Approaching the girl's corpse, the major put his foot on her head and continued to clarify for the worker that the charlatan in the hospital had diagnosed her with the remaining half of the year. The worker felt awkward listening to such personal things, but the soldier continued to tell how the doctor had diagnosed some genetic brain disease and that he was dying. And this angered the major because he was already a cripple and now he was slowly dying. Having smashed the skull of a corpse, a terrible man, and no better monster than those who ran around the island, concluded that the top and the authorities would definitely fall for this. When the great monologue about the great name of the major was completed, he again turned his attention to the worker, addressing him even as a friend, and said that he was no longer needed, which not only surprised but frightened him. The major held a pistol in his hands and said that he would never have thought that he would stumble upon luck so suddenly. The photo of the girl was lying on the major's desk where she was with her dead father and uncle, and he had already been informed how she had followed the scent to the mainland to take revenge, and the military man liked this game more. Suddenly such a cruel man, having caught an autumn leaf in his hand, smiled and said to himself that it was as if God himself had given him a sign from above in the form of such a gift, and then he squeezed the leaf until it crunched, and menacingly said through his teeth that the girl would become his property. Pyongyul was carrying this sleepy property on his back, thinking about what a fool he was if he agreed to this. And when, in addition to snoring, Kimlin also began to snore, the young man was completely shocked at how one could sleep so soundly. It was dark all around, and only in the workshop, which was located on the seashore, work continued. The commander watched as the workers piled up the boat parts and muttered under his breath to the island resident that if she had managed to steal someone else's boat, she should have thought of cleaning up her tracks. Also, the old fart still couldn't stop being indignant, only because the gendarmes showed up ahead of time, even though he was prepared for them. In front of the commander stood a major, whom he asked how much time had passed since the start of the search, and he answered that 2 days, and that was too long in the opinion of the chief, so he sarcastically threw out the suggestion that they had become scared. But the major assured the commander that he was not afraid, because he had personally searched the entire district, and the chief immediately objected that he had not addressed him at all but those 2 workers, so that they would get those 2 people. The major wanted to understand whether he could leave after that savage woman was brought to the commander, but he indifferently replied that the man should decide for himself. The commander-in-chief gave the major free rein, which he immediately limited in his actions because he reminded him that his father's life depended on him, and the poor fellow, starting to get nervous, realized that for now, the conversation was enough and replied that he understood everything, after which he was sent to catch fish. The commander immediately suspected that there was an impression that some fact was being hidden from him, so he thought about setting up an ambush for the girl. Meanwhile, in a hut in the middle of the forest, Kuman, who had been carried on Ryu Pyongyul's back, was finishing her nap. The girl again began to chatter in her sleep about continuing the journey and the smell, while Pyongyul sat on the floor and held his head with his hand, scolding himself for his stupid habit of picking up anything from the ground. The guy finally managed to open a bottle of 18-year-old whiskey, so everything that was troubling him had already disappeared somewhere, but Kimlin immediately reacted to the sound as if it were a gunshot and opened her eyes. Pyongyul was already anticipating how he would enjoy the divine drink, forgetting about worldly vanity with every sip. But the guy's dreams and plans were interrupted by a sharp change in the girl's position from horizontal to vertical, which he did not expect at all. Miraculously, the young man managed to move to the side, so Kumlan hit his face with all his might against a wooden post, although the landing should have been softer. Looking at how the girl was trying to come to her senses, Pyongyul, out of fear, began to bombard her with questions like when she managed to wake up and why she attacked. But the most terrible moment was when the guy realized that all that was left of that wonderful adult whiskey was the neck of the bottle in his hand, and he immediately demanded that he be given his money back for such a treasure. Kumlan, rubbing her head after the blow, at first did not understand what this stranger wanted from her, and only after that she began to ask who he was and what this place was and how she got here, and the offended young man explained that he saved her. Ryu walked up to the wall and went down, taking something out and simultaneously telling that he had rummaged around a bit in the girl's things to figure out who she was. Still in the same offended mood, the guy threw a grenade and a knife towards Kimlin, telling her that she could take her things or not because it didn't matter to him, but he didn't expect what would come of it. With a deft movement of her hand, the girl caught everything that was flying in her direction at once and did not drop anything. Pyongyul just wondered what the hell was going on, and as the silence dragged on, Kumlan stared at him in confusion. Now, in addition to what the young man saw in the woman's bag, he also realized how fast Kimlin's reaction was for an ordinary girl from the island, and her eyes were different from ordinary ones. Ryu, for his own conviction and understanding, asked only one question before him about whether the Japanese were pursuing the girl, and she immediately reacted sharply by shouting whether the guy was with them, but he muttered when he would finally hear a thank you. Instead of a thank you, some strange sound came from Kimlin, but it was not something from the objects in her hands but came from the girl herself. After a short rumbling, there followed such a loud and long sound as if some animal was dying of hunger inside Kimlin, and then everything became clear to Ryu. The young man's face changed to a friendly one, and he turned to the stranger with an understanding of her feeling of hunger. So he offered to eat first, but she shouted to stop messing with her brains and wanted to find out something again about evil intentions. But hunger really took its toll, and Kimlin couldn't even really say anything because instead of her, the silence in the hut was broken by her rumbling stomach. Pengel felt a bit uneasy from such a phenomenally long rumbling, so he insisted on eating again, and the girl modestly said that she would just try. Now the cat also wanted to purr, so he stretched while lying down after a sweet sleep and yawned, making a funny sound. The bowls on the table were empty, but Ryu continued to convince the stranger that there were soldiers everywhere on the street, like search dogs trying to find her. Pengil had no intention of detaining the girl, but he advised her to quickly hide behind the mountain at dawn. Kumlan seemed not to hear the young man's words and reached for the door handle, which made him nervous and raised his tone, reminding him that he didn't need to leave now. The girl turned around and, apologizing, briefly and sternly replied that this was none of the guy's business, so she had nothing to tell him. But Ryu reached out to Kimlen, trying to explain to her that the matter actually concerned him too, since he was essentially hiding a criminal. The young man, without suspecting any danger, stopped the stranger by putting his hand on her shoulder and directly stating that he would not let her go until dawn. Kumlan half turned around and asked who the hell he was and why the hell he smelled so much like the Japanese. Very calmly but confidently, the island resident took advantage of the fact that the guy's hand was on her shoulder. Ryu didn't even have time to blink before he was already doing a somersault, flying to the other end of the room, and it was the same skinny islander he thought did it. The only thing the guy could do was to look at his trajectory and immediately think about where this beast got such strength from in flight. The young man was not upset by the fact that he would fly across the entire room and fall painfully somewhere on the floor or against the wall, but he was scared that he would fly straight into his beloved Hanzik. Having got his bearings in time, Ryu managed to grab onto a beam that was in the ceiling, thereby changing the place of his landing. Pengel stood firmly on his feet right next to his cute pet, who was only too happy to see his owner, so he immediately began to purr. Kumlan was surprised that the guy was able to land, and Ryu did not understand what kind of skills the sniffer dog had that allowed her to smell. The girl already asked the question point blank about who was watching her then, and asked immediately not to interfere with her and not to get in her way. Otherwise there would be problems, but Ryu did not understand this, and on the contrary said that he was covering her from the Japanese. Pyongyil's mind flashed through how the stranger constantly addressed him as if she were not addressing him, but someone else. And this made him understand that she somehow knew from the very beginning that he was not here alone. Therefore, the next moment, Ryu's cry was heard from the hut to his assistants Dusik and Samsik to be careful, but it is clear that no one understood anything. Pengel didn't have time to prevent the next catastrophe because the girl had already pointed her fists at the door. How Kumlan scared the poor guys by breaking through the wall, and if they hadn't ducked, their heads would have been smashed to pieces too. Dusik and Samsik found themselves in different directions from the doors, not knowing which deity to pray to, so they named everyone they remembered and even remembered their own mother. They were so scared. Kumlan finally ran away as she wanted, and Ryu immediately checked if his guys were okay, but they were only shocked by how strong this little girl was. Pengel could only shout after the stranger that she shouldn't have been so handsy, because if he had been on the side of the Japanese, he would have killed her while she was still sleeping. Kimlin stopped, and without even turning around, decided to check the smell of those two, but they didn't smell like Japanese, and in general, they were weaklings. The crooks were so angry at the brazen behavior of some savage that one of them challenged the girl to a fight. Samsik's fists were itching, so he continued to call the girl to a showdown, but Ryu at this time again wondered who she was if she could break through a wall. All three of them looked after the fleeing savage, and one of the partners asked if they should have let the girl go, and Ryu didn't answer, but in his thoughts he thought about how capable this person was and that it was a pity that such talent would go to waste. The guys reminded the leader that in such a situation, they would also be better off getting out of here, and Pengel agreed that it was really worth packing up and getting out. Very secretly and carefully, the gang moved from bush to bush, advancing towards their destination, trying not to fall into the clutches of the law. Ryu reminded the gang that they might not know, but his identity was exposed, so right now they need to scatter, and the skirmish will be with the senile old man. And when the big guy didn't understand what a skirmish was, the skinny friend explained it to him. Pengil indicated that as soon as they meet at the appointed place, they should immediately run away, and if anyone is late, they will get there by land themselves. The big guy again didn't understand one of his leader's colloquial words and asked his skinny friend, but now even he knew what it was and decided to ask the cat, but he only hissed at the fools, which was also appropriate. The young man didn't say anything to the guys, but in his head he was playing out a dialogue with himself about how the Japanese could have already caught the girl, and after that his conscience would torment him until death. The thoughts dragged on for too long, and Dusik reminded his friend that they were about to scatter, so Ryu spat on interfering in the life of a stranger and ordered the guys to disperse. The guys left promising that they wouldn't be late, and when they were far enough away, Ryu mentally asked them for forgiveness and, putting the briefcase on the sand, folded his hands in respect for them and prayed that they would live well because he gave them more jewelry. Pengil decided not to rush to escape for now, but before embracing freedom, he wanted to shake up the Yakuza and find the Major. The guy looked up somewhere, thinking that perhaps this was his last chance to sincerely repent. The Major, sitting on a chair, also looked into the distance, thinking that the girl should finally make a choice, because his situation was becoming more difficult with each passing minute. The islander was also looking into the distance at that moment, realizing that she was very close to what she had come for. Sitting on the roof of the house, the girl, like all the previous times, clearly felt and saw the smell of the Japanese, but a completely different and strange smell was coming from there. For the first time, Kuman felt such a distinct smell of decay that it was impossible to confuse with anything else. The settlement where the girl was located was enveloped in the light of the aging moon, in addition to the light that came from the houses of the local residents. Kumlan continued to sit on the roof of one of the houses and peer into where the smell was coming from, recognizing its components, and so far it was even more striking than the smell of medicine. The girl's sense of smell became so acute that she could even separate the stench into separate smells that merged, and it was the stench of rotten fish and also used gunpowder, but her eyes widened when she realized that she had smelled the smell of rotten flesh. Kumlan's jaw clenched in anger when she recognized the smell of pollock, sardines, and herring that were usually caught in their settlement on the island, and this only meant that the freaks had pulled the buried people out of their graves. The girl prepared to do what she came for, quietly asking the freaks to wait a bit, and then jumped in the direction from which the smell was coming, thinking that they didn't have long left. And while Kimlin was rushing towards the barracks, someone's fist was rushing towards the Major's face with a cry that he had finally been found. Ryu looked at the pitiful sight of the man's scream and his simply raised arms, after which he turned to him, mocking him for the fact that Majors were really taught such defense. Only the soldier wanted to scream even louder. Only now, to raise the alarm, Pyongyang grabbed him by the clothes and pointed his finger at his lips, whispering that he should close his mitten, otherwise he would not live long. The Major smiled nervously, asking if the young man had come here by order of the Yakuza, which surprised him. Ryu opened the officer's eyes to the fact that he simply beat up the Yakuza, stole their clothes, and after finding out the Major's location, infiltrated under the guise of one of the guards. The grown man looked at the boy with naive, childish eyes, and even said out loud that he couldn't believe in such a cunning plan. The Major bleated that he had ordered the Yakuza to bring the guy, but in the end it turned out that they were now lying around somewhere beaten, and some even without clothes. Pengil rolled his eyes, remembering how he had beaten up that gang, and they had easily given away the location of their commander, which made the guy proud of himself. The young man twisted his arms from behind and grabbed the Major by the hands, interrogating him about his name and who he worked for, but the guy held up well and kept silent, only throwing dirt at the guy in his head. The fact that the soldier was silent did not stop Ryu from examining him himself for any clues, the first of which was the trace of a torn-off chest badge of a rifle platoon. It wasn't that difficult to hold Major Pyongyang, since he could even talk to him at the same time about how the one they called the Savage had a new model of hand grenade and also an old dagger. Ryu apologized to the soldier and took the pistol out of the holster, continuing to tell that on the dagger case there was an engraving with the name of the bloodhound Yun Cheok. From all this, the conclusion emerges that for someone like the Major, this is too serious a matter. The guy became curious about what he would see on the Nambu 94 pistol, but the weapon itself disgusted him, because how could an officer of a rifle platoon carry something like that on him? The officer's shameful state and the danger of the situation completely confused Ryu, because it was unclear who was responsible for the operation, since he was doing all sorts of things. The boys slowly moved toward the huge barracks, and the Pengil was now doubly curious about what was in that tent and why the officer was guarding it all alone. Quick and clear steps were heard behind him, to which the officer reacted instantly and shouted the guy's full name as if trying to warn him. The soldier explained to the guy that now he wouldn't get off so easily after making such a serious mistake. But Ryu no longer listened and only looked up. The officer also decided to turn around at least somehow, to understand whether he was wrong in his suspicions about who was approaching them. If you don't know the whole story and the essence of what's happening, you might think that Kumlan is flying towards his enemies straight from the moon. Just looking at the expression on Kimlan's face, one could understand that it was not worth angering or hurting the girls, because the beast would break out, and even if it weren't for her mutation, she would still have bitten their throats, and it was too late for the guys to run. Despite the fact that both fell, Ryu did not let go of the major with the same hand that he held, and the girl became even more angry upon recognizing the young man as a deceiver. Pengel didn't like the girl's mood at all, so he explained that he sincerely didn't understand what had happened in her life, but he convincingly asked her to act more quietly because he was trying to help, but Kumlan cut her off, saying that she didn't need anyone's help. The girl immediately emphasized an even more important detail, that the guy really was a liar, and her suspicions that he was Japanese were confirmed. Ryu, as always in his smiling manner, decided to try to reduce everything to a joke that the girl promised to pay for the soup and whiskey, so he asked her to listen, but she was not going to waste time on this and immediately went on the attack. While the young people were sorting things out about why the guy was wearing Japanese clothes, and he was explaining that it was a cover for saving the girl, the major meanwhile crawled towards the tent in good health. The officer found the blindfold to open the doors by touch, all the while keeping his eyes on the crazy woman who had come herself, just as the commander had wanted. The soldier, like in a fairy tale, pulled the rope and the door opened, but he didn't know what else the girl was capable of, so he stood with his back to her. Kumlan immediately turned around, not at the sound, but at the smell, and realized that she was already where she needed to be to implement the plan. The officer peered into the darkness and whispered to the major that the crazy resident was here, just as he had wished. But the man did not hear anything in response, and only stared somewhere down the tent, trying to see what was lying on the ground. Entering inside, the officer seemed to be swallowed by darkness, and only the rope that opened the door swayed from his touch. And so, having plopped down on the ground, the officer appeared again, but for some reason he was very alarmed by the fact that the father, for some unknown reason, was lying on the ground and did not answer his son's questions. Ryu also noticed the soldier's state of numbness, so he immediately asked Kimlan if there were really corpses on the ground and if she was somehow connected with this, but the girl remained silent. The islander was silent but knew that she would go there no matter what it cost her, and Ryu understood that the picture had been drawn in such a way that now he definitely would not be able to leave the girl alone. The soldier was not an experiment, but nevertheless his very wounded and therefore embittered beast was also bursting to get out. So when it dawned on him what had happened, he again went into the darkness, cursing the bastard Yanagi for not fulfilling his promise. The officer ran into the tent shouting that even if he died now, the major would still remain the same vile creature and would definitely go to hell. In the pitch darkness, the officer's loud words were heard about what a bastard Yanagi was, followed by the sound of flesh being cut. The tent suddenly became very quiet, as if no one was there and no one had entered it, and this frightened me even more. But suddenly a shot rang out, which appeared as a small spark in the middle of the tent, after which a small smoke danced, and now only Yanagi's voice could be heard, ordering the fat pig to get away, and an officer was staggering at the entrance. The soldier didn't even have time to finish saying that he would destroy the freak before he fell dead to the ground bleeding, and the commander indignantly noted how insignificant he was, because all he knew how to do was get in the way, and Kumlan asked them to come in quickly, because the corpses from the village were lying on the ground. The girl felt like a monster was bursting out of her, but she calmly replied that she would come in without a fucking invitation. With a scream of "Die!" Kumlan rushed into battle, but the major already had a pistol prepared for such an occasion. The shots didn't matter to the girl because she was already doomed to exist differently from everyone else, and for now, it was to her advantage. But Yanagi was still able to shoot the girl, and more than once he understood that she was not afraid anyway, because he watched how the transformation into a monster was successfully completed, since an ordinary person would have fallen to the ground after the first shot. Kimlan jumped again and flew at the enemy instead of running to finish everything as quickly as possible, and the major would have really liked to put the last bullet into her heart, but before that he was burning with curiosity about what was wrong with her thirst, and kept a living person near him. The girl's gaze really showed savagery and a thirst for blood, but not for ordinary people, but for a specific person who dared to decide the fate of her family. How the poor thing's gaze changed in an instant when she saw familiar eyes next to this freak of a soldier, and he actually told her to take a closer look. Kumlan abruptly restrained herself, and upon landing she could not believe her eyes, so she asked if Uncle Don had really survived. The girl assured him that she would save her uncle, and the major decided to give the man a chance to speak as well, so he pulled the gag out of his mouth. Only the uncle crawled close to the soldier, screaming and begging to save him from this monster that stood in front of them, and even the girl's words about who she was didn't help. The resident's eyes filled with tears again, and she immediately asked what this creature had done to her uncle, to which he calmly explained how he had picked him up on the island while he was unconscious, and reminded her that they were actually grateful for something like that. Kimlin didn't answer, so Yanagi decided to put pressure on her again by squeezing his uncle's neck with a gun and continued to watch the reaction. And for now he realized that it didn't look like the savage was holding back. The major let the man go, asking Kimlin directly if she would like to taste fresh flesh since the smell was appetizing, and the man had not yet rotted. The girl, although wounded, warned that if the Japanese touched the uncle even once more, he would definitely rip out his guts. But while Yanagi was having heart-to-heart talks, a knife blade flashed in the darkness. The major couldn't understand whether this idiot was pretending to be something, or whether she really didn't realize anything, and while he was thinking, the knife slowly but surely crept up to his throat, and then the other hand joined in. Ryu immediately indicated that the major should put the gun on the ground and then turned to the girl with a request to somehow help herself cover her wounds for now. Yanagi smiled, praising the guy for being really helpful, but Ryu was interested in the answer to the question of why he was here alone, and Kimlin was thinking about how this deceiver entered so quietly. The young man pointed to the major to get up, but when he reached for something, he immediately warned him not to do anything stupid, and Yanagi still reached out, telling Kimlin that the transformation process was complete, but it was quite surprising that she didn't need anyone. When Ryu stopped the major thinking that he would take the weapon, he looked at the guy reminding him of the request to stand up, so he took hold of the crutch and also asked the girl to be careful because there were traps ahead. Pyongyil held the weapon in front of him, asking the girl to sit down for now, but Yanagi assured the guy not to worry because after the infection, she became special, so the wounds would heal quickly, and Ryu no longer understood this. The commander sincerely admired the experiment, admitting that he was seeing something like this for the first time while looking at the islander. Kumlan felt only how her body was burning from the inside and looked at the soldier like a beast, and he, hobbling towards her, asked her not to look because he felt like a villain, but in fact he was also putting his life on the line. The major finally decided to introduce himself as Yanagiwara Shun, deputy head of the 173rd Laboratory of the 3rd Research Center, which is under the command of the headquarters of the chosen troops. But if we get closer to the point, Xiong briefly described that he is studying the parasite that is currently in the girl's brain. After everything the poor thing had been through, hearing something living in her head now seemed like a terrible dream, and the ground was slipping out from under her feet. Yanagi smiled and assured the girl that he was now her only ally, which of course sounded like complete nonsense. Kumlan did not understand anything that the enemy told her, and even more so did not believe that he was her ally. But the commander briefly answered her only that his life was at stake. The man quite seriously told about the state of his body, namely that he was lame, and if he was attacked, he would not be able to defend himself. But even despite his helplessness, he still had a proposal to the girl. The islander, not knowing everything yet, was angry at the commander, so she warned him that she didn't care what he said, because he would kill him anyway, and Yanagi replied that the girl could do whatever she wanted, while Pyongyil shouted that the bleeding had to be left. Yanagi decided to chat a little with the girl on the topic that interests her the most, and asked what her biggest fear is now, and suggested two options himself, one of which is the missed opportunity to take revenge. Kumlan was silent, but her body began to involuntarily tremble when the commander named the second version of fear, and this is a loss to the thirst that rages inside. Yanagi, continuing to watch the experiment closely, suggested a way out of the situation in the form of a solution to the girl's problem, and her facial expression immediately changed, after which he asked if he had managed to interest the guest. Ryu had many questions about the research team, but the most important one was why they needed this particular girl. The commander decided to tell the backstory of what happened, and began with the fact that China was famous not only for its large territory, but also for a huge number of legends. And one said that inside the glacier of Mount Murion lived a yokai that drove people crazy. Until now, The reason for such madness has not been determined because there were many theories such as that bombs or climate change were to blame, and therefore, for unclear reasons, the glacier that had long frightened people melted and parasites awakened in it. Ordinary residents of the village, not knowing such details, drank meltwater and accordingly died either from eating it or from parasites. Now that Yanagi continued to talk about the military, who began to conduct experiments in the form of cutting, burning, and other things, it became more clear why they were needed. But there was no result, and all because the person did not have enough knowledge to understand the essence of what was happening. And if he managed to find out, then only that the cause of the infection was parasites that affected the nervous system. When Yanagi said that the military was attracting colonial investors for new research, Kuman immediately responded, and the commander himself replied that indeed, the inhabitants of Manhwa Island also became experimental subjects. The man explained that the top brass did all these terrible things only to change the course of the current war, but if before that, people were simply dying, now they were mocked before that. Kimlin, less aggressively but still not believing the soldier, asked what parasites he was talking about if she had taken a regular pill, and he actually confirmed that the pill was regular starch. But the water that was in the glass turned out to be not simple, since it was in it that the parasite was located, and the tablet was essentially a dummy. When Yanagi asked again whether the girl had been deaf before the experiment, Pyongyul could not hide his sincere surprise. But the commander did not pay attention to the young man, and continued to explain that he and the girl were in the same boat because he also had problems with his brain. So for people like them, parasites, this was salvation. The poor thing remembered how her body began to hurt terribly, but at the same time her hearing returned, and Yanagi, as if confirming her thoughts, explained that parasites remove the defects of the host organism to improve their own existence. The man also added that most of the test subjects, after turning into a monster, only had instincts left, and only a few managed to retain their minds without losing their humanity. Yanagi returned again to the most interesting thing, namely, that the girl managed to restrain her thirst after her common sense returned, and he asked if she liked the gift in the form of the ability to hear this world. Pyongyul stood in a stupor, still not understanding anything that was said to the military, especially about the fact that there was a parasite in Kumlan, and that it turned out that she was deaf. The islander got angry at the commander, asking again what the hell a gift was if her house was destroyed because of him, but she didn't have time to say that it was destroyed because Yanagi interrupted her. The commander admitted that he had nothing to do with what happened on Manhwa Island, at least because he does not welcome the waste of manpower, but still, thanks to this, he was able to meet the girl and therefore hope for survival. Kimlan stood in the middle of the tent holding her wounded hand and again shouted at Yanagi to stop chatting and was about to send him to the next world, but she felt something in her body and froze in place. The wound site suddenly began to hiss and either smoke or steam came out from there, but a bullet appeared, as if someone was pushing it out of the skin. As a result, all 3 bullets fell out of the body onto the floor, and Ryu stood and looked at this wild spectacle. The guy couldn't find the words, but the commander helped him by asking if he was still just standing there, so that Ryu wouldn't be left idle. He asked him to fire a shot into the air to scare the girl, but he refused to do it. Yanagi clarified to the swindler that he should have shot faster, since there was a high probability that the 3 of them would die, but at the same time, he added that if he was okay as is, he could continue to stand rooted to the spot. Pyongyul still didn't trust the commander, and he wanted more than anything to cut off this suspicious guy's head. But the young man felt that this man was speaking as if he was no longer held by anything in this life, and that he was irritating. And after these thoughts, 2 shots were heard. Yanagi, immediately after the shot, turned to the girl and loudly shouted for her to wake up, which worked because the girl was holding her ears tightly with her hands. When the islander's attention was on the commander, he immediately asked to listen to her carefully about the fact that, according to the experiments, those test subjects to whom reason returned remained alive but could not resist the thirst for flesh. Yanagi explained that it was all due to the effects of parasites, so the thirst was incredible, and this is now noticeable in the girl's condition. The commander warned the girl that if she resisted hunger, the mind that had returned would leave the body again, and this would continue until the parasites received what they needed. The picture became clearer when Yanagi also said that the military forcibly prevented thirst, but the test subjects still became monsters, and the last ones lasted 2 months, which is quite a long time, but for Kimlin it sounded like a death sentence. The girl claimed that her mind never left her body, but the commander immediately ordered her to stop pretending, because he was more than sure that she had already lost her mind. To confirm his own statements, Yanagi asked if Kumlan remembered what happened that very day on the island. The girl wanted to say something but hesitated, and Yanagi asked her to try to look for moments in her head when she felt fear or anger, and after he saw the reaction, he pushed her to answer that the memories were cut off and this was proof. Yanagi repeated to Kimlin that she had managed to regain her sanity, but without quenching her thirst, it would leave her body again, and this would become more and more intense each time. To clarify the situation, the commander finally said that the girl needed to find an inhibitor, and she asked what it was and why she needed it. Yanagi explained how before the experiments on Manhwa Island, the military conducted research in the Manchurian laboratory, and in addition, there were those who conducted experiments on their own to create a drug that would suppress the process of turning into a monster. The commander added that, in short, the experimenters, most likely like himself, wanted to infect themselves, and Pyongyang, meanwhile, could not forget that Manchuria was mentioned there. There was both a good and a bad discovery of an inhibitor that could quench thirst, but the underground laboratory was abandoned. Yanagi wanted to share with the islander that he had been diagnosed with a brain disease a long time ago, so in order to live at least a little longer, he stopped feeling his left leg, and recently the doctor said that he had 3 months left to live. That's why this meeting took place, and the commander asked the girl for help in getting the parasite and the inhibitor so that the infection would be safe and would cure him. But instead of Kumlan, Pyongyang turned to Yanagi. The boy told the man that his story seemed familiar to him, and Yanagi explained that the reason for the experiments on Manhwa Island was that the military had figured out the conditions for creating one random test subject who would survive. But because the man was able to escape, the situation with the research became more complicated. So the commander immediately asked the guy if he had ever met another one who was not like everyone else. Ryu immediately realized that they wanted to use him in exactly the same way, but Yanagi immediately warned that in exchange for completing the task, he would provide him with documents and a house. Pengal liked this proposal, and he said directly that it was quite tempting, but he just didn't know how to trust a military man. Yanagi looked at the young man and simply answered him that he was not lying, while reminding him that he was a swindler and had somehow lost his wits. Ryu's irritation only grew even more, and he mentally admitted that if everything the commander said was really nonsense, then he would be an even better swindler, and he repeated that he was here only to make one proposal. Pyongyang listened attentively to what he needed to do in exchange for the house and documents, and Yanagi said that it was necessary to get the inhibitor from that abandoned laboratory and that it needed to be done before his squad arrived there, which was before the next month. As a counter-argument, Ryu used the fact that Yanagi killed his own man, which means it is even more difficult to trust him. And the commander, turning to the entrance, realized who the guy was talking about. The soldier explained that such arrogant freaks as this corpse would betray their own comrades without any problems. The commander asked to send the man who was sitting by the wall somewhere outside of Joseon, and warned Pyongyang that even if he refused the mission, no one would catch him since Yanagi did not really want to do so. The man hit the nail on the head when he told the boy that he wouldn't be upset if he missed the chance to reveal the identity of the person who was able to kill his own people. Yanagi calmly exhaled, closed his eyes, and told the guys that the gendarmes would soon arrive here, so no matter what choice they made, they would be provided with a car and an escape route. Ryu was already prepared to carry out the task and began by approaching the man, and then turning to Kimlan, said that they needed to deliver the man to a safe place, but the girl was in no hurry to answer. Kumlan was in no hurry to answer or move towards the exit, but only looked at the commander, saying that she could not understand what he said, but these words did not sound false, so she wanted to check something. Yanagi did not resist, but on the contrary gave the green light to the islander, saying that no matter what kind of test this was, let her do it. And Kimlin wanted to know if she would be able to restrain herself from that moment on. The commander froze, not understanding what the girl had in mind, but she was already flying towards him at breakneck speed, asking him again what he had said, how he was putting his life on the line. So she decided to find out what her price was. Suddenly, before Kumlan's eyes appeared her native island, namely her favorite place on that island in the shade of a tree, and in addition to the wind, she again heard her father's cry. The father called his daughter as he had during their last meeting, and this cry was heartbreaking for the girl. From a bird's eye view, she saw the hut in which she and her father had lived all the time before the incident on the island. Kumlan woke up in a hut as a little girl, thinking about what kind of place this was and how cold it was and how everything was shaking, and her father was still sitting over her and calling her by name. The girl just thought that she was so cold, probably because of her illness, when suddenly her father slapped her and ordered her to get up. The girl felt blow after blow on her face from her father, and her requests and cries for him to stop did not help. The little girl screamed the word daddy and woke up from her sleep covered in cold sweat, and at that moment Hansik was sitting on her. While the girl was recovering from sleep, the car took them further and further from the place where she had met the enemy. Hansik continued to take advantage of the man's helplessness and hit Kimlin's face with his paw, helping her to wake up faster. Finally, the task of the great hero cat was completed, and as soon as the girl got up, he ran away, and she herself realized that she was riding in the car that the soldier gave her and the guy, and it was he who let out a laugh from the side. Ryu couldn't calm down and continued to laugh at how the girl was muttering funny in her sleep, which made Kimlin very surprised. The islander asked the young man what exactly she had said in her sleep, and he, embarrassed, covered his mouth, giggling again, and claiming that it was a secret. But still, the most important thing Ryu told the girl was that she slept for 3 whole days, and Kimlin was shocked by this. But the guy was still having fun, because at first she had a fight with that soldier, but when she got into the car, she immediately passed out. It was very difficult for the islander to believe that she had really slept for 3 days, but then she realized that she only remembered what happened in the tent, and after that it was already dark. The last time she was near Yanagi, the girl attacked him with her fists in order to check the value of his life that he had put on the line and hit him in the leg. The man who had seen everything in his life saw such strange behavior for the first time, but Kimlin thus became convinced that the left leg was truly atrophied. Pyongyul was then no less stupefied than Yanagi, watching the girl take out her anger on him, and thus once again became convinced that she was truly crazy. Kumlan remembered that after the skirmish with Yanagi, she got into the car that was taking her and Ryu to the train station, and the young man just confirmed her thoughts by saying that they were going to Sunshin Station now, and then they would get on the train. The car suddenly stopped in the middle of the road, and this confused Kumlan. So she immediately asked her fellow traveler why they were stopping. The girl stated the fact that there was no station here yet, and Ryu grimaced as he explained that the driver needed to change the coals since an order had been issued to reduce the use of gasoline. Pyongyul decided not to waste time and told his fellow traveler their plan for how they would go to Manpo, which, although small as a gulkin's nose, still requires caution. While the guys were driving past the beautiful landscapes, Kumlan, although with great effort, squeezed out words of gratitude to the guy, and Ryu immediately threw out a sarcastic question. Has the weirdo really learned to say such a word? But the girl responded to the young man's sarcasm by adding that she would help him until they found what they were going for, and promised to repay the debt, and Ryu became interested in how she would do it, but she remained silent. The car was taking the young people to their destination, and Ryu admitted to his partner that he also agreed to this job not out of great love for volunteering, but simply was not sure that the major would leave him alone, and besides, some of them were illiterate. Having shown Kumlan a stack of papers, Pyongyul reminded her of how she read the document upside down and asked how she was even going to go to work at the medical center. But the evil islander immediately snapped that on the island they called her smart. Ryu realized that there was no need to anger the wild cat and began to explain that the laboratory was located underground, and in addition, the Japanese had sealed the entrance with cement, so he planned to dig a tunnel, but there was a risk of infected being there. Immediately after these explanations, Kumlan said that she had a request for the guy, which surprised him very much, but the girl still asked that he seemed to know how to fight well, so she wanted to become stronger with his help. Surprisingly, Pyongyul, without even thinking or asking anything else, refused the girl's idea to teach her how to fight. Kimlin didn't expect such a turn of events, and Ryu tried to explain to her that she was already incredibly strong, so a month or 2 of training would not give any effect. Upon arrival, the city of Manpo greeted the travelers with quite lively streets full of people and beautiful views beyond. Ryu walked forward, continuing to mumble to his partner that she should practice her pronunciation instead of her fists, because it made her stand out too much from the crowd, and also asked her not to stare at the buns because he wouldn't buy them anyway. The crook asked Kimlin to behave quietly and then wanted to say something about their plans in a month, but the girl interrupted, asking about what happened in Manchuria, because it seemed to her that it was connected with the guy. The young man's expression changed to indifference, and he said that the girl wouldn't understand anyway, but instead he pointed out to her the improvement in how she looked because her outfit was conspicuous and she looked like a country bumpkin, which angered her. Having reached one house, the young man pointed at it with his finger, and told his partner that they would spend the night there. But Kimlin was so fed up with this idiot calling her a country bumpkin that she announced that she would only need a day to become a city dweller. The girl rushed away herself, having made a bet, because in exchange for her transformation she demanded training in combat. But Ryu still called her a country bumpkin and warned her not to follow strangers. The angry islander walked forward without noticing anyone and thought that she had thanked this impudent fellow in vain because he was always asking to be beaten. But the girl noticed something from the outside as she walked through the crowd of local residents, each going about their own business. Kumlan realized that for the first time in several days, her easy laughter and simple dialogues, as well as irritation over trifles, had returned to her. Walking around the town, the girl looked at the local women, still remembering the young man's words about her appearance. In Kumlan's head, she heard the impudent man's voice and his words about how the country bumpkin shouldn't be conspicuous to anyone. And then she looked at her clothes and wondered if she really was that different from the others, and something clanked in her cape. Taking her bag in her hands, the first thing the girl thought was how this Pengil annoys her. But then she thought about when he managed to put money in her bag and a note about her buying herself clothes. The islander just approached the store from which people were leaving with new purchases, and at the entrance a worker bowed to them in gratitude, calling them to come again. At that moment, Kumlan felt so awkward and wanted to hide, so she involuntarily hugged herself but armed herself with the fact that she wanted to prove to Ryu how wrong he was about her. The doorbell at the store announced a new customer, and the girl, with difficulty pronouncing a greeting, told the workers that she needed women's clothing. The women threw up their hands and immediately bombarded the girl with questions about where she was from and whether she was from a fishing village, and one of the workers even stood behind her because she smelled terribly of the client. Kumlan could barely utter anything because the women immediately pounced, discussing the fact that the girl looked just like them before they got a job at the store, and were arguing and laughing more than helping, no longer hearing the client at all. Unable to withstand such a hubbub and pressure, the girl flew out of the store, shouting only that she would come back next time sometime. While Kumlan stood there trying to catch her breath, feeling a wave of nausea, the women in the store were shocked by such an abrupt departure, but immediately realized that they themselves had been stupid and had frightened the poor little girl. The girl walked further down the street, realizing that she hadn't felt anything when she had turned away from Pengil, but now she almost felt sick. Kumlan broke into a run because she felt the pressure of the city and its noise and stench, so she needed to run somewhere else. In the girl's head, Ryu's voice sounded, ironically repeating that it was difficult to call these unfortunate 2 meters a city, but even that made her feel bad. Covering her ears with her hands, Kumlan ran forward, experiencing unbearable sensations, realizing that this was, after all, a small city. At some point, the islander realized that she really wanted the silence that always calmed her down on her native island. Kumlan had already reached the guest house but realized that she didn't want to give up so quickly, so she decided to move on. Running past the next houses, the girl slowed down a little and then stopped completely, catching her breath and turning towards the smell that she liked. Having opened the door, Kumlan confidently entered the room, as she already understood that they definitely served tea here and it smelled pretty good. Turning to the host, the guest asked him to serve her the cheapest tea and added, "Please," as if Pyongyang was standing behind her, mocking her for being such a country bumpkin. The girl was brought tea and a bun with it, and steam was coming from everything, which was very pleasant after such a long journey. In the tavern, Kumlan sat alone, and she liked it here definitely more than in that clothing store, and she was also proud of herself for how naturally she managed to ask for tea. Having calmly exhaled, the foreigner looked at the interesting room and its details, but at the same time remembering Ryu's words that they had a month, which meant that she needed to somehow get training from him, and all in order to avenge her father's death. Kumlan finally calmed down and relaxed, and thinking that her father was with her now, she said mentally that they would rest over tea, and then she would go to Pyongyang. With the first sip, the girl did not close her eyes as she would with a gentle kiss, but on the contrary, she bulged them out as if she were experiencing something nasty. The first thing that Kumlan felt was bitterness, but not the kind that she would like, but a terrible one, as if she had drunk ground coal. The girl immediately called the owner using the words "sorry" and "I beg your pardon," but no one approached her. Instead of the owner, customers entered the tavern, loudly discussing something, and then Kumlan drooped, not finishing her question about tea. The men were loudly and zealously discussing some last fight, the stake of which had disappointed them, and that instead it would have been better to eat with this money, and from this the islander again had to cover her ears, realizing that it was time to leave here. But instead of rushing off, the girl folded her hands as if in prayer and asked herself to try to get used to this place, because further on the cities would be bigger and it would not be possible to run forever. Taking a deep breath, Kumlan thought about the sounds and smells of the city and decided to imagine how she was currently somewhere on Manhwa, with the morning wind caressing her cheeks and the smell of fish reaching her nose. The girl imagined a hut and dense vegetation around it, so the smell of grass drowned out the smell of fish. And the pleasant ending to the picture was the noise and view of the sea, which was flaunting its waves. It was as if Kumlan looked at herself from the outside before the terrible incident, as she, out of old habit, sat on a stone with her eyes closed and enjoyed the moment. The girl caught herself thinking that she was so eager to get to the mainland for a better life and civilization that now she misses home, and because of this, she became depressed. Looking ahead, Kumlan thought that in this world, there were only 3 people left who knew her. The girl looked at the men who were sitting in front of her, but she no longer heard what they were talking about and instead sobbed with sadness. Kimlin couldn't find anything better than to drown out her pain with even more bitter tea, so she took sharp, large sips and then returned the empty cup to the saucer. Grimacing from such a wild drink, the girl decided not to give up under any circumstances because she could not lose to Pyongyang. Opening her eyes, the guest was in for a surprise, but it was not a compliment from the establishment, but something worse. Kumlan was ready to shout not just to the whole city, but to the whole world that her wallet had been stolen right from under her nose. The girl didn't care about the money, because the most important thing was the letter from her father that he left as a farewell, and then her curse became a gift for her, because with her keen hearing, she caught the words of the thief that the silver bracelet looked expensive. For the locals, it looked strange from the outside as a strangely dressed girl flew out of the tavern screaming "thief" and stood still. While Kumlan was running and shouting that the man was a corpse if she caught him, Ryu was disappointed with the villager, quietly repeating to himself that he had asked to blend into the crowd. After all, it wasn't difficult at all. Through Pengul's eyes, the situation looked a little different, and all the time while the girl was unable to find a place for herself in the city, he secretly kept an eye on her so that he could come to her aid if necessary. Already disguised as a local resident, the young man looked from under the gate at how Kimlin stood hesitantly near the store, but did not immediately understand what she was doing there. But when Ryu saw the store sign, he smiled and remembered that he had given the girl money so that she could buy clothes. But Kimlin ran out even before the guy admitted that he didn't even think that the village girl's choice would fall on such a store. But he didn't gloat, but rather understood that she at least tried it. The guy lowered his hat a little lower to slightly cover his face and came out from around the corner because he sensed that the girl would do something else. And since the young man was a crook and still listened to his intuition, he decided that it wouldn't hurt if he kept an eye on his partner for a while longer. Kumlan was still running after the thief who stole the bag of money and her father's note right from under her nose when she had just begun to calmly perceive the bustle of the city. While the girl was cursing at the idiot who robbed her, and everything was getting more complicated due to the large number of other smells and sounds, a rude man next to her called her over to him. Because Kimlin was trying to understand where she was, she did not hear the first appeal, so the man addressed her a second time. The big guy warned the stranger that she shouldn't go that way because there was a ring there, and she immediately asked if he had seen a thief running there. The man was surprised and did not understand the question, explaining that there was no one else in the area except pickpockets. And now Kimlin did not understand him. And while they were talking, someone had found a catch for himself. The untrustworthy guy immediately called Kimlin a beauty and asked what she was doing there. But the man stood up for the girl, telling the tramp that she was his younger sister's friend, and asked the stranger to leave. The tramp seemed not to hear the warning and asked the girl again if she wanted him to become her friend. The brute looked closely at the crazy man and said that it was rather strange that he had not understood what was said the first time. A stern look was enough for the ghoul to suddenly remember some urgent matters of his own and go away as far as possible. Kumlan asked for forgiveness and asked again about the ring, to which the man explained to her that they bring in laborers and then fight to raise money, and he was surprised that the girl had not heard of such a thing, so he immediately asked where she was from. But without waiting for an answer, the big guy gently took the stranger by the shoulder and admitted that she looked the same age as his sister and therefore wanted to give her some good advice. The man warned the young lady not to try to earn a living here, otherwise it would break her and it would be better to go home. Kumlan stared somewhere through the man and repeated this warm to the point of pain. Word home. Left alone in the middle of the road, the girl quietly muttered words of gratitude under her breath and was still recovering from the uncle's advice. The girl was confused and tried to figure out how she could now find her wallet and what a true city dweller would do in her place. It dawned on Kumlan, because she remembered the missionary's words about what needed to be done in such cases. Without thinking about the consequences, the islander ran to the station to report to the patrol officers that her valuables were missing. Luckily, the personal bodyguard arrived in time, making the right choice to keep an eye on what the villager would do in the city. Ryu dragged the girl away from the area and said nothing other than "follow me," so at first Kimlin didn't even understand who he was and perceived the man as another crook. Finding himself in a secluded place, Ryu immediately asked what the girl was going to do, to which she quite seriously said that she was going to the patrolman because that's how she was taught, which is why the young man was outraged because he knew how the situation could end. The guy got scared that they were about to be caught and it could end badly, so he emotionally shouted that the girl could have already shaken the boss's hand right away so that the Japanese would catch them right away. But Kimlin did not understand why the Japanese were there. Pengil sighed heavily and decided to move away from the topic by asking Kumlan what was wrong with her clothes and why she hadn't bought anything, to which the girl timidly said that she didn't like anything. Still, the young man couldn't calm down and he lost his temper again, wondering if the villagers would continue to hang around the city in such a state. But Kimlin didn't understand the problem in the suitcase because she had seen many people in robes. Ryu once again let out a long sigh of displeasure, saying that he was unable to bear the islanders' stubbornness and was immediately distracted by the noise next to them. The young man noticed a father and daughter talking near the place where he and Kimlin were, and it looked like they were having some kind of conflict that Ryu didn't like very much. All trembling, Kumlan told the swindler that at first you can't tell, but she is one of those who learns very quickly. But he sarcastically distorted her into saying that she probably wanted to say that she is one of those who ruins everything in no time. Here, Kumlan grimaced with anger, feeling that the moment would come when she would hit him so hard that he would not know what hit him. Pengil explained to the girl that he had carefully studied the major's notes while she was sleeping in the car, and it said that she was now like a time bomb, so she couldn't provoke the parasite unnecessarily, so she had to behave quietly. Kumlan immediately reminded Ryu that she understood this and therefore asked to teach her how to fight so as not to resort to the power of the parasite. The guy understood what was going on and asked the islander point blank if she really wanted revenge that much, to which she quietly asked as if confirming that it really wasn't obvious. And Pyongyang remained silent, looking at how tightly the girl was holding onto her coat. In his mind, the young man thought that he had seen with his own eyes the girl's suffering during all 3 days of the trip. Ryu, although he tried to seem cold, but his heart ached when he saw how tears flowed from Kimlin's eyes while she slept all 3 days and 3 nights as they rode. So he looked after her as best he could, at least wiping her face. Remembering how they talked upon arriving in the city, Pyongyang admitted that he had behaved like a cracker and now realized that the girl was scared to be in the city for the first time, even though it was small. Periodically observing his partner, the young man realized that even if a person had acquired phenomenal strength, this did not mean that the personality itself would change at the snap of a finger. And even now, looking at the girl, Ryu already knew that as soon as the tension subsided, Kimlin would again become a simple islander, so he asked her what exactly she meant by revenge. Seeing the girl's reaction, Pyongyang asked an even more specific question about what the purpose of revenge was, but she still did not understand. And then the young man explained that this thing corrodes a person like a parasite, and if it starts easily, it is difficult to finish. A certain understanding appeared in Kumlan's eyes, so Pyongyang continued to tell her that the concept of revenge might change greatly when she takes the inhibitor and gets time. And from this, revenge will lead to a quagmire of suffering and hatred. Before leaving to do his business, the young man told the girl that he had left her clothes in the room so that she could wear them for now, and then went to the meeting place. In the light of the lantern on the table, there were many papers with drawings and notes that were all needed for the same important matter. When everything was voiced and shown on paper, Ryu asked those present what they thought about the plan and whether it would be possible to implement it. While no one had yet responded, Pyongyang wanted to thank the first madam of the Yellow River Detective Circles for the gift of clothes and also expressed his pleasant surprise at seeing her here, which was an honor for him. The guy said that in addition to the plan, there were deadlines that amounted to 1 month and showed on paper how they would make a shelter out of an abandoned house and then start digging a tunnel when construction began at the power plant. When the lady said that the young man need not worry because he would be provided with the best team, he took his leave, and before leaving said only that he was really counting on help. Kumlan did not waste her time in the city, so her fists were already busy with important matters. The girl fought against a huge man who, between blows, mocked how she had already won twice. The big guy couldn't think of anything better than to put psychological pressure on the girl by ridiculing her stances and punches, and also noted that most likely they simply gave in to her because they felt sorry for the poor guy. That's how 3 weeks later, Kumlan found herself in a mixed martial arts match, looking at the back of her opponent, who was shouting to the crowd that the woman had reached the very bottom of Manpo City. The big guy didn't stop making sarcastic comments towards the girl, and this time, he wondered if she had braided her hair to make it easier to grab, but she slashed that she had to be able to catch it first. The crook got seriously nervous watching his student, and although he admitted that Kimlin's progress was good, it was too noticeable. One worker noticed the way the guy was looking at the girl and called out asking if he had also bet on the girl, but Ryu didn't understand the question at first. The man explained that the new girl had 2 wins right away, and although she didn't have any proper blows, she still managed to defeat her opponents, and Pyongyang decided to pretend that he figured it out. The worker called the girl a real talent, so he decided to put all his money on her and laughed loudly, which the guy again supported by playing along. The young man looked at the battlefield, specifically at his student, and mentally agreed with his uncle and his opinion about the new sensation. Ryu also admitted that even if we don't take into account Kimlin's infection, she really has talent for a country bumpkin. No one really even guessed that this talented girl managed to reach the level of 2 victories thanks to killer training. Only Pyongyang knew that the test that the girl had gone through was beyond the capabilities of a human being and was not within everyone's power, and only the one who was being pursued by the shadow of hell was able to overcome it. 3 weeks ago, when the guys had just arrived in the city of Kumlan, they immediately became interested in nothing other than fights without rules, and Ryu finally agreed to explain to her that only laborers or the brave take part in them, and those who have money make bets. Pengel noticed that the girl did not react to his words and looked around, and when she finally paid attention, she noticed that there were not many Japanese in the city, and the young man explained that they lived with their own people, and again asked if the girl wanted to learn wrestling. The guy decided for himself that it would be better to train the country bumpkin himself than for her to go into the ring on her own, but he warned her that in a month, nothing much might change for her, and then Kimlin let out her most deadly burp. Ryu burst out laughing, but not because of the food that fell, but because the girl sounded like a real wild animal, and he decided to ask Kimlin point blank how she could eat so much and still be hungry, and whether she wasn't even ashamed. The girl did not understand why she should be ashamed, and instead of apologizing, she wanted to know if she could make a hole in the bastard's head with a skewer. But he quickly praised the student's interest and zeal, so he suggested starting by watching others fight. Ryu intended to visit those same fights without rules, but the sword was still there, and Kimlin demanded that she did not need to look at others, but wanted to watch how the young man fought, and he explained that for this, it was still necessary to learn the basics. By blackmailing the young man with a skewer, the islander wanted to know if she would be able to enter the ring after training, but for Ryu this sounded absurd, so he let out a nervous laugh again. Pyongyang realized that there was nowhere to go, and taking the stone began to explain that the principle of combat is to inflict more damage and receive less, and for this you need to analyze the enemy, and this entails receiving many blows in order to understand the style. Throwing the stone high, Ryu clarified to the girl that he would not tire of repeating that safety was the most important thing for him. These words about safety sounded in her head, and Kimlin came to her senses when the man tried to shout to her for the umpteenth time. The enemy was irritated by the fact that this weakling was bored and did not react to his comments and continued to snap back. While the bull's blows passed by Kimlin, she kept replaying in her head the teacher's words about her advantage being her incredibly sensitive hearing and observation skills, as well as what she had experienced before. Ryu advised the girl to take on board her best skill and listen to every sound, which in turn would help track the enemy's movements, and at the same time, it was necessary not to forget about defense. The crowd was cheering, and this created additional interference, but in Kumlan's head there was Pengel's voice saying that the most important thing was not to rush, because they did not know what exactly provoked the transformation into a monster. The young man, who had seen the cruel world, warned the girl that no matter how good her technique was, everything could be decided in one moment by the same shot and just one, and in the meantime she did everything so that the man would run out of breath. Kumlan decided that victory would be hers at any cost, and Ryu appeared before her eyes again, and how they talked while finishing their delicious food. The islander listened attentively about how things were going with the laboratory and the inhibitor, but the guy immediately clarified that he would figure everything out so she could train in peace, but she still didn't understand why he was trying so hard. Pyongyal said directly that he was a swindler and saw his own benefit in everything, and Kumlan timidly admitted that she did not want to increase her debt, but the young man, smiling slyly, asked her to calm down because he knew that she was broke. The girl asked again whether there were 2 fights a week, and seeing how the guy nodded, she asked him to bet on her in the 4th fight, saying that she would definitely earn money. The guy burst out laughing, leaving Kimlin stunned, but he explained that he really liked the joke and then said seriously that the girl would win, but there would be no trace of the opponent left. Continuing to laugh at the villager, Ryu listened as she came up with the idea of dodging until the enemy ran out of breath. But from this, the young man began to laugh even more, but rarely stopped when he saw a serious face. Kumlan looked at her opponent, and in that moment made a firm decision for herself that she would definitely win because she couldn't stand being indebted to someone. The islander's eyes suddenly began to hurt and she quickly rubbed them so as not to lose her vigilance, while the enemy was thinking about whether the girl was going to win the fight with dodges alone or not. The brute decided that he didn't care about pride, and he would simply crush the weakling with his weight, so he rushed at her. But the young lady was already prepared for this. Kumlan faced what Ryu had warned her about, that there would be those in the ring who would throw pride aside for the opportunity to make money. The girl remembered the training and how Pengel told her that the first couple of fights would be easy because of pride, men do not fight at full strength, and it is better to give in to a woman but not disgrace themselves. That's why it was easier for Kumlan to meet those bastards on the battlefield who would do anything for the sake of victory, even to the point of killing. All the fights, Ryu's words led the girl to victory, but now when she remembered how he asked her to surrender if necessary so as not to wake up the parasite, she decided that she would not retreat and carefully watch the enemy. Kumlan did not want to give up because it was just hand-to-hand combat, and she could even withstand bullets, so she began to analyze the possible blow that the enemy was going to inflict. At some point, the islander caught with her ears how the enemy's muscles in his left forearm were contracting, which looked like a trap. Understanding the technique, Kimlin already saw how the opponent deliberately raised his knee, pretending to hit her in the stomach. But in fact, he had already prepared his right hand to grab her by the throat and hit her with a swinging elbow. Now knowing that the attack was just a trick, the girl had to get closer and control her strength so as not to kill the unfortunate man, but simply knock him down. Kumlan was very worried about not overdoing it with the power, because that could have broken a skull like a ripe watermelon. But the thug gave a sign that he was alive, and the girl was happy about this, although in fact she should have been happy that he had died or had hurt himself in some way. Barely standing on his feet and rubbing his neck, the man walked towards the scoundrel, wondering where she was going to go, to which Kimlin asked if he really wanted to continue. The girl thought to herself that the fight looked like it was over, but she was confused by the sound of metal ringing in her opponent's pocket. The enemy backed away towards the scoundrel while she mentally told the rogue to watch carefully how everything was going for her. When the enemy attacked Kumlan, she also mentally asked her father for forgiveness for the fact that only 3 weeks had passed and she was already much better, and the enemies flew to the ground. Kimlin was going to throw it towards the bully and tell him something last, so she told him to listen carefully, but a knife blade rang out in front of her face, cutting the air. Ryu bit his nails, nervous as never before in his life, thinking that the redneck was overdoing it, even though they were talking about something completely different. The guy looked closely at what would happen next, but didn't show it, and only prayed that the girl wouldn't do anything wrong. While the man sat over the wounded girl, the crowd split into 2 camps, where some were ready to eat their clothes, rooting for the new girl, while others were thirsty for retribution from the bully. The bully quietly informed Kimlin that if she survives, she should be more careful not only in the ring, but also outside of it, since there are already those who are trying to kill her. The psychopath looked at his victim, telling her that because of the loss of 2 men to some woman, the ring's income had hit rock bottom, and asked if she really didn't know how many Japanese were walking around here. The man still held the knife in the girl's body, and promised her that he would beat her to such an extent that she would not be able to come here on her own 2 feet. So he warned her to grit her teeth. Kumlan already wanted to shout to the judge that she was giving up, but she couldn't because the knife started spinning inside her, and the thug told her that she should have thought about it earlier, but suddenly she said a strange phrase that she wanted to eat, which the opponent didn't understand. The girl warned the enemy for the last time that if he wanted to live, it would be better to leave her quickly, but he did not take it seriously, and then the islander saw her conversation with Ryu when she asked to kill her if she lost her mind. Only now, looking at the eyes that had changed dramatically, the man realized that he was in serious trouble. But the monster had already tasted blood with its tongue, and the hungry beast within was just itching to get out and sink its teeth into the enemy's throat. Suddenly, instead of human screams from what they saw or splashes of blood, a hand reached out to the rays of the sun, giving a sign. There was complete silence in the arena, and everyone froze, looking at the opponents below, waiting to see what would happen next. Through clenched teeth and barely holding herself back, the girl raised her hand and said that she surrendered, and then people began to shout what was happening, to which the judge loudly announced defeat. The judge raised his hand at the top of his lungs and yelled that number 17, after 5 victories in a row, had voluntarily announced that he was giving up, and the spectators began to shout angry cries. And the man who bragged to Ryu that he had put all his money on the girl began to shake the soul out of him, crying that this was the end, and the young man's words that he had nothing to do with it did not help. But he was proud of how stamina the country bumpkin had. The uncle did not stop shaking the young man, shouting at the top of his lungs what they should do now. But Ryu was already thinking that today, after all, Kimlin had won, namely her mind, so he thought about treating her to beef. And Pyongyang decided to play along with the saddened man and answered philosophically that this is how life works, because you just think that victory is in your pocket and then you suffer defeat. The guy wanted to say something else, but his speech was cut short as people from the crowd began to whistle and shout where the girl was going, and she really did run away from the battlefield. The judge loudly told everyone to watch carefully how the coward's heels were flashing, and that she was wasting her energy on cowardice instead of putting in the fight. And while everyone was indignant and the uncle was crying, Ryu realized that the next fight was canceled. The one who plunged the knife into the girl staggered like a drunk, barely standing on his feet. And that was thanks to the judge, but he still continued to mock his opponent, shouting that she had no place in the ring because she was a woman, and eventually began to lose his balance. Even gravity could win the fight, but not this ghoul, so no matter how the judge asked him to wake up, it was all in vain, and Ryu thought that it would be nice for him to thank fate. Otherwise, he would have died altogether. Since there was nothing left to worry about, Pengel again began to think about completing the penetration into the laboratory, and then it was a small matter, and the uncle, noticing the guy's movement, asked if he was coming too. When Ryu asked the tearful worker where exactly he thought they should go, he told him about the festival in honor of the completion of the power plant. It dawned on Ryu, and his uncle, noticing such a reaction, asked again if he hadn't heard about this. So he also added that they would be setting off fireworks at the end. Pyongyang finally saw the light when he remembered, thanks to the worker, that he and his partners had actually agreed to finish the tunnel when the fireworks were launched. But the problem was that they would be launched next to the cafe where Kuman goes. The man was crying so much that he couldn't open his eyes, and turning around in that state, he offered the guy something to drink away his sorrows. But when he opened his eyes, he discovered that he had disappeared. Kumlan really liked that particular cafe on the outskirts called Scarlet Foliage from the moment she first visited it. And now, having escaped from the battle, the girl sat at the table, recovering from the horror that she had to experience again. The islander became scared because the words of the Japanese Yanagi were ringing in her head about how the test subjects were able to hold out for 2 months. Now Kumlan was angry at Yanagi, thinking that she should have not restrained herself but rather spoiled his face. The girl admitted to herself that she was not prepared for it to be so difficult, and before her eyes again appeared the moment when her fist froze in front of the major's nose. Kumlan held her fist, bared her teeth, and muttered, "Bastard, why didn't he dodge the blow?" Yanagi calmly and with a slight smile on his face repeated to the islander that he had been ready for his death for a long time, so there was no point in being afraid and running away. And he described the girl's condition as being in despair over her imminent transformation into a soulless creature. The commander looked down and told Kimlin that she didn't have to lose her mind to create hell in real life, and so he reminded her of cooperation again. The girl was silent, listening attentively to what Yanagi was saying about her, including the state of the trap she had fallen into, since the parasite would torment her forever. The major was not a mere talker and said that he had notes that would help the girl cope with her thirst. But there was one thing, but even here he faltered. Yanagi wanted to say about some desire, but didn't know how to call it correctly. But Kimlin understood what he meant, and of all of them, only Ryu didn't understand. To understand how to express himself further, the commander asked whether it was worth talking about such things in front of the guy, and then Pengil felt uneasy. But Kumlan glared at him and asked directly what was meant, because the desire to eat a person. Ryu didn't feel any better about this news, especially when Yanagi clarified that it wasn't even about a person, but about the desire to eat brains, which is why the inhibitor is so necessary, since it will initiate the development of a drug to remove the parasite from the body. The commander directly said that this is why they met, to ask the girl to test the inhibitor, and Kimlin immediately understood that this experiment would be carried out on her, which Yanagi confirmed but indicated the use of each other for this. The major also frankly stated that his notes could be wrong, but the inhibitor also might not have any effect, but if nothing is tried at all, the girl will continue to consciously run and eat brains. Yanagi added to Kimlan that it doesn't matter whether she avenges her loved ones or becomes an experiment. The fact that she is infected will not change, but in order to preserve a drop of humanity in herself, he asked her to take a notebook. The last thing that sounded in the islander's head was the major's words that if everything went well, she would be able to use the parasite's power as she wished, and at that moment, fireworks were already visible in the window. Looking at the flight of a bright artificial comet, one could count down to the moment the monster would awaken again. When the first explosion occurred, people in the cafe reacted in a normal way, and some were even upset, not seeing any joy in these fireworks. But for the girl, the sounds outside the window were like cannon shots that only raised a new wave of transformation. Kumlan's eyes opened wide, and in her head the voice did not sound like her father's at all, but his words sounded about the girl having to live. With each explosion of fireworks, the most terrible images of what she had to endure appeared before the island residents' eyes in equally bright flashes. It was no longer Kimlin who was looking at the remains of the flying fireworks, but what guided her when it was necessary, so the color of her eyes changed again. Pulling herself together as best she could, the girl, holding onto the walls, walked out of the coffee shop and prayed not to run into anyone on the way. Kumlan felt how dangerous it was for her to stay here, and the sounds became more and more terrible for her sensitive receptors. But the most disgusting sound for the girl's ears then was the disgusting voice of that idiot whom she almost finished off in the ring, and even now he managed to fall under her hot hand. Dubina grabbed his rival and dragged her along with him under the pretext of having a drink together, but her refusals were not accepted. This pig decided to pretend to apologize for the recent incident, justifying himself by saying that he didn't know that the girl would be so scared, but he realized that she definitely had a stubborn nature. The big guy didn't hear Kimlin's refusal, and pretending to apologize, continued to force her to drink, saying that it was not proper to refuse elders, and then a hand rushed towards him. The bully only managed to close his eyes in fear, but the girl stopped herself in time from hitting him. Kimlan was shaking all over because it wasn't her who wanted to hit, but she still apologized and lied that she would drink with the fighter next time. The man was clearly not sober anymore as he covered his face and said, laughing, that he almost crapped his pants. From the coffee shop came the same cheerful and drunken voices of men who told the big guy that he had not almost done it, and he himself laughed awkwardly at this. But the fun ended immediately after the bastard grabbed the girl by the throat, asking through clenched teeth how much longer she would mock him. Kumlan could barely speak, her throat was so constricted, but she still said that she had already apologized and asked to let her go. The crazy man was not satisfied with this answer, and he quietly told the girl that she would follow him right now. The creature led the poor fellow to the foot of the hill, right where fireworks were being launched all over the sky, and did not yet know what awaited him. Snotty, holding tightly by the hand, decided to tell her that he had thought of eliminating her before the fight, but had to wait because of the big shots who had come to the festival. Having thrown the unfortunate woman to the ground, the bull shouted to her that this was already the second time he was trying to wipe her off the face of the earth, and it was already getting pretty annoying. And then the ghoul said something that he would later deeply regret, because he admitted that he was an orphan who had spent his whole life in the ring. So if he killed someone, no one would care, and Kimlin repeated these cherished words to herself. Fireworks were still exploding in the sky, and tears were running from Kimlin's eyes along with a smile on her face, because after hearing the news from the victim that no one would even remember her, she felt better. Outside the window, sparks from another firework were descending, and so far there was no next one nearby. The men stared out the coffee shop window discussing how the show had ended so quickly. But for some, the holiday had only just begun because now it was possible to give yourself and the one who controlled Kumlan a little freedom. Having taken a good running start, the girl put so much force into her blow that the freak could have spat out his organs. Like a bull, the girl rushed with the next blow at the freak. But then she remembered Yanagi's words about humanity, and although her teeth were already grinding with anger, her hand relaxed and the word humanity stuck in her head. Kumlan grabbed her head, trying to bring herself to her senses, and no longer paid attention to her body, so she turned around to leave. But before that, she warned the big guy not to get up. The girl gradually regained her sanity, and therefore told the ghoul that she would leave the ring and never appear there again. But a fool will not understand that he is a fool because he is a fool. Therefore, the selfless one took the stone in his hand, thinking of his victim as a bitch who will not leave until she dies. Kumlan didn't suspect anything like that, and since her condition was still not stable, she continued to tell herself under her breath that this pig should leave her alone, and walked forward with her back to him. Words and warnings did not help the freak, so he ran and jumped, raising his hand with the stone over the girl. While one ran to kill, the other ran to prevent it, but there was very little time left. Covered in sweat and breathing deeply, Pengo rushed forward to find the girl before her most intense test. While the guy was running, he overheard the locals talking about how what the whole city had been waiting for was finally about to happen. Ryu realized that it was too late to rush around and listen to the residents discussing the largest firecracker that had been brought from China. The young man thought so much about Kimlin that he didn't even notice how he was standing in a puddle. But in his thoughts, he believed in her like no one else, remembering how hard and persistently she trained. A firecracker flew into the sky with a whistle, and along with it, Pengil's message to the villagers that he believed in her with all his heart. The only one who didn't believe it was the idiot who stood and looked at the bloody stone and then at the girl with a broken head, but didn't believe how this was possible. And this made him not just scared, but terrified. Kumlan's head was bleeding and she should have fallen dead from such a blow, but instead she walked up to the bastard and grabbed the stone in his hand with her hand. Dubalom was still mocking and writing it all off as jokes, telling the girl that she had a pretty good grip, and did she really want to measure her strength now? But Kumlan simultaneously slowly said that a month had passed since then, and also slowly squeezed her hand, lowering it down until the freak grimaced, and a crunch was heard from the hand and bones began to stick out. The girl did not stop at the broken wrist and continued to say that she suffered from hunger all this time, or rather every day, every hour, minute, and second. But the ghoul could no longer say anything except make sounds of pain. After Kumlan said that there was not a single moment when she did not want to eat, she squeezed the stone with her hand so hard that she broke the freak's fingers. Having twisted the arm of the stupid opponent even more, the girl heard in her direction what kind of crap she was talking about, and after all, no one was stopping her from going and eating to her heart's content. Another crunch was heard, followed by a scream, and in the eyes of such a confident man, one could already read fear, which intensified after he heard that the girl needed human flesh. Kumlan told the idiot that regular food was not good for her because she could eat and eat, after which she bit her hand and continued to repeat this word many times. It got to the point that the brave fighter wet his pants and started calling for his mommy, but the girl asked him if he knew what she was thinking in the ring. A firework exploded brightly in the sky, illuminating the face of the girl who was biting herself and holding back the monster. And since there was no answer, Kimlin told the freak that she wanted to taste what the brains of her opponent were like, who was now screaming in horror. If it weren't for the loud sounds of fireworks, you could hear the breathing of a young man in the clearing, who was running as fast as he could towards the girl, not yet knowing who he would need to save. While Pyongyil was running, he simultaneously prayed that the villagers would endure thanks to the training, and that if you think about it, this was just an ordinary firework. Calming himself down, Ryu only made his worst fears even louder, and stopping to catch his breath, he began to get angry that he couldn't find this idiot anywhere. And this was followed by a feeling of guilt. Guilt overwhelmed the young man and began to gnaw at him for the fact that he had in vain let the girl into the ring. And lowering his head in despair, the guy realized that he had stopped in the right place. The blood was not only under Pyongyil's feet, but stretched further in a long path, and now all that was left was to follow it. As Ryu approached the top of the hill, he heard strange sounds near the trees and noticed a dark shape. Coming even closer, the guy noticed how the eyes sparkled in the darkness, and it looked like it was Kimlin. So he asked the villager if it was her, but at the same time he prepared a pistol. The reaction was not long in coming, and the monster paid attention to the sound of living flesh, and as soon as Kimlin wanted to move, the young man asked her to sit still. But to his surprise, she called him by name in a voice that was not her own. In a hoarse and creepy voice, the monster began to pronounce the young man's full name syllable by syllable, and he was shocked that the girl still had her mind. Despite such a terrible moment, the monster said something like the rogue was cute, and Ryu forgot for a second that it wasn't Kimlin in front of him yet. Pengel blushed with embarrassment and timidly began to justify himself that he was not that handsome. And then, the monster said another strange phrase about how the guy considered himself handsome, and the guy did not understand this at all. Since the victim had lost his vigilance, the monster raised his master's body to its feet, and while the guy was already completely confused about whether the girl was conscious or not, the parasite gave the command to the brain to attack, and Kumlan made a sharp jump. The creature appeared like a bullet near the young man with its mouth open to quickly bite into his throat. While wheezing, that Pengel smelled better than all the others, and he already pointed a pistol at the girl. The next moment, all wet and constrained by fear, Kumlan woke up in bed breathing heavily, and on top of her, like a guardian of order and peace, lay Hansik, purring. Looking around, the girl realized that she was in a hotel, but this did not reduce the number of questions. Kumlan felt terrified by the last picture before her eyes, and the fear grew, because she understood that it was no longer a dream, but that she consciously remembered what happened yesterday. Sitting on the bed, the girl was so numb from the thought that she had killed the crook that she didn't even notice from the side how the cloak was flying towards her. The poor girl jumped up on the bed, entangled in the fabric, and then even Hans couldn't stand such a sharp turn of events and ran away, while Ryu asked the girl to change her clothes because she stunk. Kumlan started screaming because her nerves were acting up like crazy and started bombarding the guy with questions. But he, as always, calmly and indifferently answered that nothing had happened, so she didn't have to worry. Also, ahead of all other questions, Pengel said that the girl had her own blood on her because she had held back yesterday, and that was why he had not shot her, and Kimlan repeated out loud to herself that nothing had really happened. But then the girl pointed her finger at the guy and asked why, if everything was fine yesterday, his shoulder muscles were crunching in a strange way, which gave Ryu goosebumps because he was shocked at how sensitive her hearing was. Looking down, Ryu showed that he had something to talk about with Kimlan, but he still assured her that there was nothing to worry about. Even now, Pyongyil remembers how next to his face, not even a mouth but a girl's mouth opened. He still said that nothing like that happened. Although Kimlan literally knocked the guy off his feet, and then he understood what it was like when such a creature could go crazy from hunger. With such strength as Kumlan, the guys flew for a decent amount of time until they fell to the ground, and it was surprising that in flight, she had not yet devoured the swindler. The girl opened her mouth wide while being right at the victim's neck, and Pyongyil then prepared for the worst by pointing a gun at her. The words of the villager were spinning in the young man's head about how if her transformation went too far, he would simply kill her, and he really began to pull the trigger. The guy was flying in the arms of death, and his life was also flying before his eyes, but at the same time he took his finger off the trigger, wondering to himself why he couldn't shoot. But the young man didn't want to die either, because he had only recently managed to escape, and at that moment he couldn't think of anything better to do than simply close his eyes, after which he heard a loud bite next to his ear. Ryu clearly understood that he heard a bite, but what's most interesting is that he didn't feel it, so preparing for the worst, he opened his eyes, not understanding what was happening. The guy watched as the girl fought with herself, biting her teeth into her own hand and hissing at him to kill her faster. Looking at this crazy sight, Pyongyil was impressed by how strong Kumlan was, and lowering his gun, he scolded himself for the fact that he, as a supporter of safety above all else, could have stooped to this. While simultaneously continuing to think that perhaps he should have dumped the idiot at the first meeting, the guy continued to correct the situation. Kumlan restrained herself with the last of her strength, continuing to bite her hand while the young man drew the poison that Yanagi had spoken about into a syringe and drew the necessary amount, but in fact this would have been enough to kill a bear. Ryu understood that he was taking a risk again, and that he had only one chance, so he trusted the willpower of Kimlan, who instantly reacted to the sound of the approaching and now definitely turned around to bite. But everything happened in time, and the poison got inside. The guy saw how the girl's eyes immediately changed color, and she froze with her mouth open right in front of his face, and he quietly asked her for just one thing, that she hold on, and after that she passed out. After the swindler's story, Kumlan asked again about what was happening. Instead of a bullet, he used poison, as if she was angry at him because of this, and directly asked why he took such a risk instead of simply killing her. Covering his mouth to hide his smile, Ryu said in a sarcastic manner that as people say, hunger is not a crime, And when his cat wants to eat, he can also bite. But Kimlan did not appreciate the joke, and that she was compared to an animal. In order not to get a slap on the back of the head, Pengil immediately turned his attention to the right channel and asked the girl that it was rather strange that she had not felt anything yet, after which Kimlan actually felt a pleasant smell. The islander's happiness knew no bounds, and she shouted that it smelled like beef, so Ryu asked his aunt to come into the room. On the tray there were 4 servings of juicy beef with vegetables, and while the waiters were leaving and Ryu was thanking her for the food, Kimlan was already drooling, holding a piece of treasure on her fork. Pyongyal turned to the village girl and quietly said that she had held up well and could therefore eat 3 whole servings. The boys began to eat, and while their mouths were full of food, Kumlan again asked the young man to keep his promise next time if she transformed again, to which Ryu made a serious face and said that his life was always more important to him. The girl also added about her decision that she would not go to the next fight, but the swindler, instead of agreeing, immediately replied that she would go out, otherwise she would look for the laboratory herself, and then Kimlan did not understand anything at all. Kumlan made a strong argument about yesterday's incident and her fear of it happening again, but Pyongyal countered by saying that it would develop a bad habit of giving up and, on top of that, reminded her that she liked fighting. To understand, the swindler explained how important it is for the girl to continue living, even if the inhibitor does not work, and the main habit should be trust in herself. So he decided that the girl must win the last one without killing the enemy. Ryu asked Kimlan not to forget that she was also a simple person, and looking down, he admitted to her that he noticed how she trained her self-control without his accompaniment, so in the ring, she would fight more with herself. The young man explained that he saw this fight as an opportunity for the girl to free herself from the past and present that were dragging her down, and instead to remember that she always had tomorrow. Ryu was so impressed by his own words that when he raised his head and saw the villager sitting in a stupor, he again returned to his jester's appearance, telling her to eat and not stare at her. Kumlan took an example from the swindler and, making an indifferent expression on her face, continued to eat, thinking that the last words seemed to have been spoken to him by himself. Pyongyal was missing something in the cooked meat, and he took a pepper shaker to season the dish, while Kumlan wanted to know another thing. Why, even after training to withstand the sounds of gunshots with fireworks, it didn't work. The crook didn't answer because the pepper just didn't want to fall out, so the islander started to think for herself that at that moment, she was already feeling pretty bad and was vulnerable to such a volume. Without answering the girl's question, the young man shouted at the pepper shaker, "Why the hell does she take him for a fool?" Swinging his hand from above, the guy solemnly declared that he was Ryu Pyongyal, and shouting about his secret weapon to always go all the way, the guy hit the pepper shaker with his fist. All the food that was on the plate looked like it had been behind the sofa where no one had cleaned for 100 years, and there was nothing else to say except shit. Pyongyal timidly asked the girl if she would share a plate of food with him, but Kumlan used her skill and growled at the swindler. Meanwhile, Yanagi was choking from coughing. With each time he spat out more and more blood, and each time it was like the first time, because he didn't want to believe that he was slowly dying inside. Sitting in his office, Major Yanagawara did nothing but try to continue living somehow, periodically cursing at his fucking cough. But even with his sad situation, the commander smiled, telling himself that he would never have thought that he would envy an ordinary island girl. And after these strange thoughts, the major also poured shit on the charlatan doctor, not understanding what 3 months he was even talking about. One of the major's subordinates appeared in the doorway of the office, and noticing the state of the commander, first only addressed him. When the man noticed that the major's attention was on him, he said that everything was ready for the trip to Manpo, and at the end asked if he was alive. Yanagi, holding a handkerchief to his mouth, could barely answer for the guys to go on a mission, and additionally ordered them to kill the guy and the girl if things got complicated.